When you break down the T-90 on paper, Russia's most modern battle tank looks pretty fierce. Among other high-tech accessories, it boasts a 125mm smoothbore gun, modular composite armor, and a 1,000+ horsepower V12 diesel engine. In theory, it offers excellent mobility, protection, and firepower, along with the ability to launch armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds and anti-tank guided missiles. The T-90 also has several variants and has been a popular export due to its relatively high cost-to-benefit ratio. Then why, you might be wondering, has the T-90 been such an epic failure on the battlefield? To be fair, it's not just the T-90s that are dropping like flies, as Russia's war with Ukraine continues. Since February last year, the Russian Armored Corps losses have since reached more than 2,100 tanks. That's around 2/3 of the tanks Russia initially rolled out of Moscow on their way to Kyiv. Russia has lost so many tanks, in fact, that they've had to reactivate and deploy hundreds of older models, including the T-72 Ural, T-62, and T-54-55, some of which are 50, 60, even 70 years old. And most of these have headed to the front without any meaningful upgrades, not since the collapse of the Soviet Union anyway, to their optics, fire control systems, or armor. It probably wasn't the first choice, one could imagine, of the boys back at the Kremlin to roll out these older models. This decision likely has something to do with the recent spike in losses of their prized T-90s. In total, Russian troops have been forced to scrap or abandon nearly 60 of these 53-ton, 3-person tanks, roughly 15% of Russia's pre-war inventory, with most being lost in only the last few months. But wait, aren't these supposed to be the baddest tanks around? That's certainly what the Kremlin's been saying. Before we get to the specific factors contributing to the T-90's proposed survivability, or lack thereof, let's take a moment to address one other important point. When we zoom out, there's an argument to be made that the increasing number of T-90s being destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine might actually be a negative sign of things to come for our friends in Kyiv. How's that? Well, let's look at it like this. One reason that so many T-90s have been destroyed recently, but certainly not the only reason, is that there's been more of them deployed to destroy. Translation: Russia's current production of T-90s has been picking up, as Putin's nearly 2-year effort to boost tank production finally seems to be paying off. Apparently, Russia has been able to work around some of its increasingly tighter foreign sanctions, including those on critical high-end electronics that it was once importing from France. As mentioned before, the number of destroyed or captured T-90s accounts for roughly a quarter of Russia's pre-war inventory. This overall number, however, does not include the hundreds that have been produced by the Ural-Vagonzavod plant in Sverdlovsk Oblast since the start of 2022. Russia's increased productivity could become a serious problem for Ukraine, considering its main tank plant, the Malyshev factory in Kharkiv, currently lacks the capacity to produce new tanks from scratch and is limited to performing upgrades and repairs. This leaves Ukraine's armored forces mostly reliant on foreign donations if they intend to deploy a fleet of modern Western-style tanks, which they have, including German Leopard 2s, British Challenger 2s, and the American M1 Abrams. But are foreign donations going to be able to match Russian tank production? Well, it's hard to say, but it probably wouldn't hurt for Ukraine's Western allies to throw in a few more tanks, especially because the Ural-Vagonzavod plant can, hypothetically, produce enough new T-90s in the next 6 months to match Ukraine's current inventory of comparable modern battle tanks. But even if this theory is true, and an increasing number of T-90s are being destroyed largely because more are being manufactured and deployed, that certainly isn't the whole story. The overall effectiveness and functionality of the T-90 has been a matter of debate since the beginning, with many distinguished experts expertly concluding that overall, the T-90 is a piece of junk. First introduced as the T-72BU, then renamed the T-90 to distinguish it from all the other T-72 variants, the T-90 was thought to be one of the most well-protected tanks in the world, while also boasting one of the most heavily equipped battle systems currently on the market. After being officially brought into service in 1992, the T-90 has received a number of upgrades and subsequent name changes. In 2004, it was renamed the T-90A, and then in 2016, it was upgraded and rebranded again as the T-90M. Then, after its most recent upgrade in 2017, it came to be called the T-90MS. There were also less popular variants along the way, but those aren't worth mentioning here. Since its conception, one of the major selling points of the T-90 has been its relatively low cost. Save for the most recent variant, the T-90MS, which runs closer to $4 million, the full line of older, less expensive T-90 models can still be purchased and exported for around $3 million. Even though it continues to be produced primarily for use by the Russian Army's armored division, the Kremlin has sold and exported thousands of T-90s, mostly T-90S variants, to countries such as Algeria, Armenia, and Iraq. In fact, India alone is now in possession of more than 2,000 Russian-built T-90Ss. Underneath the hood, so to speak, of all currently available T-90 variants is a V12 diesel engine. The most powerful, coming in at 1,130 horsepower, can be found on the T-90MS. The T-90 is also about 20 tons lighter than the M1 Abrams, and was designed to accommodate and be operated by, thanks to its auto-loading firing system, just a 3-man crew. Upon closer inspection, however, the effectiveness of both the engine and loading system have come into question. But more on that a bit later. So what about firepower? Well, if the T-90 has one thing going for it, it definitely has a lot of that. The T-90's 2A46M4 125mm smoothbore main gun can fire a range of high-tech ammunition options, including armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, as well as the anti-tank guided missiles mentioned earlier, also known as the 9M119 Reflex, or by NATO as the AT-11 Sniper. These high-tech projectiles have a maximum range of 4,000 meters, with a flight time of 11.7 seconds, and can, under certain conditions, even take down helicopters. Also in terms of firepower, the T-90 features 2 externally mounted machine guns. One is a 12.7mm cord heavy machine gun that has a cycle rate of fire of 700 to 800 rounds per minute and can be remotely operated from within the tank. The other is a PKMT 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. And when it comes to protection, in addition to conventional armor plating, modern T-90 variants also come equipped with 2 very high-tech defensive systems. The first is the Shatora-1, an active protection system made by the Russian company Electronic Torg that includes a 360-degree laser warning receiver complete with automatically triggered countermeasures. The deploy of the tank is painted by an enemy laser. This device can even orient the tank's main gun in the direction of the laser's origin. The Shatora-1, among other features, also comes with an infrared jammer and a grenade-launching system that has the capacity to discharge smoke grenades which release an infrared obscuring aerosol cloud. The modern T-90's second line of defense is its Contact 5 Explosive Reactive Armor, or ERA, which is essentially a layer of high explosive sandwiched between 2 metal plates designed to minimize the damage of explosive projectiles by detonating just prior to their impact. Pretty fancy, right? ERA was specifically designed to counter a range of advanced weaponry, including missiles and rockets carrying high explosive anti-tank warheads, as well as highly deadly sabot rounds, which separate after being fired and turn into a thin, fin-stabilized rod made of depleted uranium. Once a sabot round impacts an enemy tank, the kinetic force it creates while penetrating also creates a steam of molten metal that pours into the cabin with it. This instantaneously increases the temperature and pressure inside of the sealed turret, killing, or rather cooking, everyone inside. The T-90 also comes with a magnetic mine detection system that, when functioning properly, uses an electromagnetic pulse to disable mines before the tank can run over them. So then, what's the deal, you might be asking? Why aren't these extra fancy protection systems making the T-90s unstoppable? For one, these systems haven't performed so well against long-range anti-tank guided missiles. There was one report that stated a Ukrainian took out 2 T-90Ms back-to-back using an AT-4 anti-tank weapon. If that report is accurate, this would be a very impressive set of skills. The Swedish-made Saab AT-4, given to the Ukrainians by the US and Sweden, is a lightweight, shoulder-launched anti-armor weapon. However, despite delivering an 84mm projectile out to a range of 300 meters, this unguided weapon should not be effective against a T-90M's reactive armor, which the manufacturers claim is effective against not just low-speed rockets and missiles, but also tank rounds coming in at hypersonic speeds. There are, it seems, even more embarrassing ways to lose a tank, which Russia has also discovered recently. Apparently, a group of Russian technicians accidentally set fire to a T-72 they were attempting to repair. In the confusion, the ammunition on board caught fire and exploded, completely destroying the tank and damaging 2 others nearby. The loss of this tank and the 2 T-90Ms suggest that a more complex set of problems might be plaguing the Russian military. And this makes the actual durability and effectiveness of the T-90 more difficult to determine. Is the hyped T-90M any less vulnerable than earlier models? It's hard to tell when it's regularly being used without proper tactical or common sense. Another reason the T-90 was poorly conceived compared to other main battle tanks is that its underlying design is outdated. Ultimately, as we mentioned before, the T-90 is simply an improved version of the T-72. Essentially, the turret of the T-80 and the hull and drivetrain of the T-72 combined together and covered over with reactive armor. And because the T-90 is in its essence only an update, it retains all of the defects of its bargain-built older brothers. Its inherent shortcomings, leading to the apparent failure of the T-90's ultra-modern defensive systems, is one thing, but this tank has also been the victim of tactical incompetence and has regularly been rolled into impossible no-win situations. In modern warfare, advancing tanks are supposed to be supported by infantry, for the very purpose of suppressing enemy ground troops who might be using anti-tank weapons, like the AT-4. Deployed armor should also have artillery support, if only to help mitigate any long-range threats. Sending tanks forward without defensive support, as Russia has continued to do in Ukraine, makes them extremely vulnerable, especially to infantry units using shoulder-launched weapons. Mobile ground units, when allowed to get in close, can carry out ambushes at short range, which allows them to focus their attacks on a tank's more vulnerable target areas. A particularly vulnerable area for these tanks, that's also been exposed by the creative fighting tactics being used in Ukraine, is the roof. So it seems the T-90 has had some trouble with the anti-tank missiles that are fired from elevated positions and ultimately come down onto these vehicles from above. The T-90's 360-degree active protection system is supposed to protect from this sort of attack, and its failure to do so might suggest that this fancy new system isn't as infallible as first advertised. A range of other deficiencies came to light after the first T-90 was captured, intact, from the battlefield in Ukraine. With the tank now safely in their possession, military specialists from the Ukrainian Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment were able to conduct an analysis of all internal equipment and armaments, and went on to publicly announce their findings in March of 2023. When, around the same time, another T-90A was captured, this one was apparently handed over to the US, also for the purpose of research. But when one of Russia's most modern pieces of armor was spotted on a trailer in Louisiana, then subsequently photographed, a debate surrounding the tank's unlikely appearance on American soil exploded on social media. It isn't fully known what the US ultimately had planned for the tank, but we do know what Ukraine did with theirs. They ripped it apart, literally and figuratively. Once the team of Ukrainian experts had completed their investigation, they claimed to have uncovered little more than an old T-72 hiding beneath the shell of widespread Russian propaganda, labeling Russia's new war machine an overall failure and not nearly the breakthrough the Kremlin had been all along claiming it to be. The team of engineers from the Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment also noted that the well-praised automatic loader was largely the same design as could be found on the older T-72. The only major difference being that the ammo was now stored in a separate compartment outside the turret. This modification, however, created the complication of tankers having to fully exit the vehicle in order to load ammunition into the main compartment, which, to be done with any practical sense or relative amount of safety, would require that the tank leave the field of battle. Talk about taking yourself out of the fight. The center also reportedly discovered significant limitations concerning the T-90's B92S2F V12 diesel engine, which Ukrainian engineers claimed did not have sufficient power to reliably propel the vehicle, a claim that was supported by videos of T-90s getting stuck in the mud. They also noted that the highly praised Kalina computerized fire control system had incorporated in its design not only civilian electronic components, but some of Western origin, while other electronic components had been assembled without adhering to moisture control requirements, resulting in increased oxidation, shortened lifespan, and unexpected failure. But the embarrassment of Russian tank builders isn't the Kremlin's biggest problem here. If Ukraine persists in revealing the secrets and vulnerabilities of the allegedly advanced systems and technologies of the T-90, This could potentially create a serious financial challenge for Russia in the future. By giving other countries the information needed to produce their own, while simultaneously diminishing the hype surrounding the Russian-made T-90, sales are bound to diminish. And this is no small sum we're talking about. Russia has currently received a combined total of nearly $10 billion for exported T-90s from India and Algeria alone. But a fair amount of damage seems to have already been done. As reports of the T-90's mediocrity have continued to surface, many foreign companies that had previously signed contracts with Russia have swiftly cancelled those agreements. All these technological and mechanical shortcomings, though, are only part of the bigger story. The lack of success the T-90 has had on the battlefield in Ukraine cannot be truly understood without looking at the opposition they've faced. It would be a disservice to Ukraine's ferocious troops to do otherwise. Combined with grit and determination born largely of national pride, Ukrainian forces have also received an impressive amount of anti-tank weaponry from the US, as well as other allies. From the US alone, Ukraine has received more than 10,000 Javelin anti-armor systems, 90,000 other anti-armor systems and munitions, 8,000 tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided TOW missiles, 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms, 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, and a whole slew of laser-guided rocket systems, rocket launchers, and anti-tank mines. According to Washington's regularly updated list of wartime contributions, which includes 31 Abrams tanks, 45 T-72B tanks, 186 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 20 Mi-17 helicopters, dozens of combat drones, lots of state-of-the-art satellite communications equipment, and more than 100,000 sets of body armor and helmets, President Biden has provided nearly $44 billion in military assistance to Ukraine thus far. Weapons are a critical part of warfare, that's obvious, but without resourcefulness, they will only take a conventional force so far, which makes the new tactic Ukrainian forces have been using against Russian tanks that much more impressive. To go along with their already proven yet more traditional ambush maneuvers, they've also developed a highly creative yet simple way of utilizing landmines. Essentially, as a Russian mine plow clears a path through a known minefield, Ukrainian troops will wait for it to pass, then toss fresh mines onto the same path right in front and sometimes behind the trailing convoy, effectively littering the cleared corridor with new mines. The vehicles following the mine plow end up hitting these mines or run over the mines as they try to escape the trap. To execute this brazen new maneuver, the Ukrainians have been utilizing two different types of mines. One is the Soviet TM62, the other is the American Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM, of which the US has donated more than 30,000. The 21-pound TM62 is what you think of when you think of a traditional mine, basically a big metal disc packed with explosives and fitted with some sort of fuse. The RAM, on the other hand, is slightly different and consists of 9 mines that are 4 pounds each, stacked together in a hollow 155mm artillery shell. With practice, Ukrainian troops have found that a few well-aimed volleys can scatter scores of these, each with a magnetic fuse, across a relatively wide area. This tactic has been a big success recently, as armored vehicles have continued to roll in neat lines across the fields and forests between the Russian-occupied cities of Pavlivka and Volodar. And what often happens, after the lead tank hits a mine and explodes, the rest of the column attempts to scatter. Some vehicles try to go around the wrecked lead vehicle, only to hit a mine themselves. In these scenarios, even retreat is dangerous, as there might be fresh mines now scattered behind the column, littered across the very path it used to come through. In the past weeks, in the region surrounding Volodar, the Russians have lost 30 or more armored vehicles, including a few tanks, and it seems that well-placed mines have largely been the cause. To defeat these tactics and save a few of their prized T-90s, Russia will need, at minimum, better intelligence and a more flexible command and control strategy. In theory, the narrow TM62 minefields shouldn't be that hard to avoid if the opposing force was able to, let's say, organize 24-hour surveillance and a reliable means of disseminating information to its frontline forces. And Russia will need exactly that if they want to keep ahead of Ukraine's clearly savvy military engineers. But what do you think? Have the technical shortcomings of the Russian T-90 been the primary cause of its poor performance? Or are these tanks being utilized poorly and judged unfairly? Also, how might foreign military aid and Ukraine's improvised tactics be contributing to the loss of so many Russian tanks? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Question: what do coral reefs and much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have in common? Answer: they're both endangered species and increasingly make for breathtaking underwater tourist attractions. Sure, maybe it's low-hanging fruit, but all jokes aside, Russia only has itself to blame for the current state of its once impressive navy, which most people, Putin included, thought would steamroll Ukraine when they invaded their neighbor in 2022. Ukraine, after all, did not technically even have a navy in the strict sense of the word. First impressions, however, can be deceiving. Over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to lose a combined total of approximately 16 ships and submarines, including the crown jewel of its Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class cruiser Moskva, sunk by a pair of land-based Neptune anti-ship missiles. These are incredibly steep losses for an alleged great power, especially when you consider that most of the others were sunk by Ukrainian-designed, unmanned maritime drones packed to the rafters with explosives. These ingenious and relatively cheap systems, about $250,000 a pop, have become symbolic of Ukraine's technological savviness and innovative approach to naval warfare. Their asymmetric campaign has resulted in Russia's transformation from the indisputable maritime power in the Black Sea, on paper at least, to being pinned back into the eastern portion and unable to exert sea control over the region. Ordinarily, a military power with as much money, means, and manpower as Russia would double down on the omnipresent threat to its expensive naval assets. If the United States Navy were tasked with defending the Black Sea, it's easy to envision the strategy it would employ. One of its 11 carrier strike groups would almost undoubtedly be deployed to the region, which consists of an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers for air defense, 2 LAMPS-capable warships for anti-submarine and surface warfare, and a pair of anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. The fleet would largely be insulated from traditional and hypersonic missile threats with robust and advanced cooperative engagement capabilities, DEW technology, and long-range interceptor missile technology. With enough support ships supplying munitions, fuel, and other supplies, carrier combat aircraft could conduct electronic warfare, hunt for enemy drones, and engage the bases from which they are launched almost indefinitely until the threat was entirely neutralized. US naval assets possess superior radar and electronic warfare suites to down drones, Phalanx CIWS automated guns with 20mm Vulcan cannons, and Skynex-type airburst munitions to engage close-in surface threats and drone swarms, and helicopter-launched missiles to wipe out any drone boats that made it through the fleet's wide defensive perimeter. It would almost be overkill, and the modern US military knows almost no other way. So, why doesn't Russia follow suit? Why not deploy its own aircraft carrier to the Black Sea to help neutralize the Ukrainian maritime fleet of what, in essence, amounts to a bunch of plastic water skis with a GoPro, smartphone, and a big boomstick attached to it? The answer is that it can't. The Russian carrier, known as the Admiral Flotta Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, or Admiral Kuznetsov for short, has been undergoing a series of refittings and repairs that have relegated it to dry dock for the past few years. Though it was rumored to be ready to re-enter service by the end of 2024, experts are now wondering whether the carrier will ever sail again. Whatever its future, the vessel won't find itself anywhere near the Black Sea Fleet, or any Russian fleet for that matter, in the near or foreseeable future. Today, we're going to talk about why. If you want to measure a nation's true global power, it's often said that the best way is to look at its navy. But why? Naval vessels are expensive to produce and maintain. Only the richest nations with resources to spare can shoulder the cost of developing, testing, and projecting naval assets across the globe. As the most expensive and complex naval vessel, the modern aircraft carrier is, for good reason, almost universally viewed as the pinnacle of naval power. Those who have them can bring their bombs to bear in almost any corner of the world. Those that don't are forever doomed to the perennial role of a regional power. The history of Russia suggests that it should be at least on par with some of the world's most powerful nations at sea today. Of all Russia's service branches, the Soviet Navy was the fastest to expand after World War II. It had 421 ships of 8 different types, although these figures may be considerably larger. Its submarine fleet was world-renowned, and commensurate with its newfound status as a global power, the Soviets started to employ their navy much like the United States, to project power not just in their own geopolitical neighborhood, but around the world. From the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Arctic to the Pacific, Soviet vessels could be found performing anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft operations throughout the Cold War. The Soviets owed much of their post-1945 naval renaissance to the reforms of one man, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, who argued for specialized missile-armed ships and submarines instead of more traditional battleships and heavy cruisers well ahead of his time. With the seizure of East German shipyards, laboratories, and industries in 1945, Kuznetsov started to turn his vision into reality. He's widely credited for having pressed the Soviets to experiment with hydrofoils, sound-seeking torpedoes, radars, sonars, guided missiles, and other advanced propulsion techniques that kept them apace with American technological advances, and in addition, for elevating the Russian Navy onto equal terms with the General Staff of the ground forces, thus setting up the Soviet Union for better joint coordination and strategic success for much of the Cold War. The Soviets adhered to a simple naval strategy at the time. They prioritized nuclear second strike capabilities and then used bombers, submarines, and large surface vessels to threaten NATO's sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic. By the 1970s, rapid advances in Soviet submarine, missile, and nuclear technology enabled them to challenge the United States' previously unquestioned naval supremacy for the first time. It took until 1985, however, for the Soviet Union to build its first aircraft carrier. Built by Black Sea Shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, the Admiral Kuznetsov was officially commissioned in January 1991 and became fully operational in 1995. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, everything started to unravel. The Soviet Navy originally intended to launch a sister ship, the Varyag, but the project was disbanded in 1991, where after its incomplete and stripped hull was sold by Ukraine to China, who rebuilt the Varyag as the Liaoning, the People's Liberation Army Navy's first ever aircraft carrier. The Kuznetsov was launched at a time of unprecedented geopolitical turnover and massive budget cuts. It was fatefully marked for an inauspicious future from the start of its turbulent service history. In 1991, Ukraine officially declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That year, acting Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev thwarted a coup attempt by communist hardliners to seize control of the country's political affairs. Gorbachev envisioned a more open, decentralized Soviet government with power distributed among the nation's 15 republics. His reforms may have rubbed the old guard of communist conservatives the wrong way, but they inspired nations like Ukraine, long held under the yoke of Soviet oppression, to exert themselves in foreign affairs. Accordingly, the same year, Ukraine's first elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, told the commander of the Kuznetsov, Viktor Yarygin, that the vessel was Ukraine's rightful property. Kravchuk ordered Yarygin to keep the ship in Sevastopol until the Ukrainian government could figure out what to do. Unfortunately for Kravchuk, Russian naval commander Yuri Ustimenko swooped in and ordered the ship's crew to sail to Russian waters so it could remain in the Soviet fleet. To this day, many Ukrainians still feel the Kuznetsov was unjustly stolen from them. In reality, they may have dodged a bullet. The ship has hung like a broken-down albatross around the neck of the Russian Navy ever since, becoming far more of a burden than a blessing. Before we get into the comically tragic tale of the Kuznetsov's modern service history, let's cover the basics. Relative to modern standards, and especially compared to the nuclear-powered American supercarriers like the Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessels, the Admiral Kuznetsov is modest, unwieldy, and inefficient, and that's putting it mildly. It is 1,000 feet long. It has a 236-foot beam and a 23-foot draft, and displaces 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Steam turbines, turbo-pressurized boilers, 4 shafts, and 4 fixed-pitch propellers drive the vessel through the water, each producing 2,011 horsepower. The ship has a maximum speed of 29 knots. By comparison, the Ford-class carrier, which has unlimited range, displaces double the weight, or 100,000 tons, holds double the aircraft and well over twice the crew, and is over 30 meters longer, can still travel 1 knot faster. The power generated by the Ford-class's 2 A1B nuclear reactors generate 250% more electrical capacity than the Nimitz-class carriers, enabling them to keep pace with far smaller vessels. The Kuznetsov does not run on nuclear power and has a maximum range of 9,800 miles and operational deployment time of 45 days before it must return to port. In their infinite wisdom, when the Soviets laid the keel of their lone carrier, they decided it would run on mazut, an outdated petrochemical that hasn't been used regularly for 50 years. Once seen as an eminently viable fuel for naval energy because of its high volume-to-energy ratio, it was soon found not only to be environmentally unsound, but dangerous for the ship's own crew. Mazout, you see, is incredibly vicious and tar-like. When burned, it emits a cloying, dense cloud of black smoke that clings to sailors' clothing and skin. In 2017, the vessel gained global notoriety when Britain's then Defense Secretary Michael Fallon dubbed it the Ship of Shame, as it passed through the waters close to the English coast, belching black smoke. So what exactly can the Kuznetsov do when it isn't in port topping off its fuel tanks with fresh batches of mazout? On paper, the carrier can carry 18 Su-33s, 6 MiG-29Ks, 4 Ka-31s, and 2 Ka-27s. It's designed to sail alone, and as a result, carries greater firepower than her US counterparts, who rely on escort vessels for mutual protection. Its armaments include 12 SSN-19 shipwreck, long-range high-speed sea-skimming SSMs, 24 VLS units loaded with 192 SAN-9 Gauntlet SAMs, and 8 Kashtan CIWS with dual 30mm machine guns, and 8 AK-630 CIWS. Compared to the 4 Phalanx CIWS and 4 Sea Sparrow launchers, each with 8 missiles carried by the Nimitz class, Admiral Kuznetsov is well armed for both air defense and offensive operations against hostile shipping. The problem, as you'll see later, is merely getting and maintaining the ship in the fight, not the fight itself. The way the Kuznetsov launches its aircraft is perhaps the most recognizable design feature, or flaw, depending on who you ask. Rather than utilize a modernized steam catapult to hurl heavily laden aircraft into the air off the carrier deck at breakneck speed, the Kuznetsov utilizes an old-school bow ramp. You know, the type of thing you and your friends built in grade school to launch your bike into the air in your front yard. The chief flaw of the bow ramp is that it supposes severe limitations on the types of payloads you can launch, which, in turn, constrains the types of missions you can conduct. Physics and gravity exert more of an influence on unassisted bow ramp launch operations. Consequently, the Kuznetsov's crew must adhere to strict takeoff weight limitations, which restrict the amount of ordnance and fuel a jet can carry, and in turn, reduces the jet's offensive effectiveness and range. When the carrier launched in 1995, Russian naval officers were optimistic that the Kuznetsov, deployed in tandem with their powerful submarines, might be able to help their nation remain a major global sea power, even as the country navigated its uncertain future. It didn't take long for fate to take its course. On its first deployment to the Mediterranean in 1996, the carrier was anchored off the port of Tartus, Syria, to conduct its first set of continuous flight operations. At one point during the mission, the carrier's evaporators broke down, stranding thousands of Russian sailors aboard with no fresh water. It was the start of an almost endless stream of technical, mechanical, and engineering issues. Over the next 20 years, Admiral Kuznetsov conducted a series of additional deployments and demonstrations in the Mediterranean, North Sea, Barents Sea, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. Working with other Russian surface ships, it was pretty common to see the carrier involved in large-scale exercises, rescue operations, escort missions, and naturally, extensive maintenance whenever something broke or needed revitalization. In 2005, one of the carrier's Su-33 aircraft accidentally fell off the back into the Atlantic, one of the first indicators of the vessel's accident-prone reputation. 4 years later, a short circuit sparked a small fire aboard the ship while it was anchored off the Turkish coast. Carbon monoxide poisoning led to the death of one Russian sailor. Just a month later, the carrier found itself in the middle of a massive oil spill that resulted when it tried to refuel at sea with several other Russian vessels off the southern coast of Ireland. The crew was very grateful to return to dry dock for scheduled repairs over the next year. It was business as usual for 2 more years before the next incident struck. In February 2012, after a long, meandering journey around the tip of Scotland and into the Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov lost propulsion and set adrift in the Bay of Biscay on its return to its home base of Severomorsk. Embarrassingly, the carrier had to be towed the 2,700 miles back to Russia by tugboat, a gesture symbolic of the ship's next decade of service. It would not return to the high seas until 2014, having conducted just 6 overseas patrols across its 23-year lifespan thus far. Still, Russian naval officials were optimistic by the mid-2010s that despite strict financial constraints and recurring technical glitches, the Kuznetsov could remain operational well into the 2030s. Theirs was an incredibly rose-colored prognosis. By 2016, when the carrier set to sea en route to the Mediterranean, it had to be accompanied by 7 other vessels, including an ocean-going tugboat as a precaution due to potential propulsion failure. It pretty much always goes out with a tugboat, noted Dmitry Gorenberg, a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs division of the CNA. "It's in extremely poor material condition," he added. "The pilots are not proficient at all. They don't spend enough time at sea." Another popular military blog at the time put it more succinctly, calling the ship a piece of crap. And, well, they were right. In late 2016, things got pretty dire for the old admiral. Though its carrier air wing had been upgraded with the latest and greatest Russian multi-role aircraft and naval attack helicopters, its latest deployment to the Mediterranean suffered from a shortage of trained pilots, which limited the amount of fixed-wing aircraft it could launch at any given moment. As the carrier group approached the eastern coast of Crete, one of its MiG-29Ks took off from the carrier and returned as planned, only to find the Kuznetsov's deck crews were frantically repairing a broken arresting cable. The carrier commander, with plenty of time to divert the aircraft to a nearby airbase, dithered in the hopes his crew could fix the problem in time. Well, they couldn't. While circling the carrier, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to eject into the sea. 2 weeks later, the Kuznetsov participated in its first ever combat operations, launching a series of Su-33 strikes against ISIS in Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry pointed out that the strikes were responsible for killing at least 30 enemy militants, including top field commanders. But Kuznetsov simply couldn't stay out of the news. A week later, another Su-33 crashed into the sea attempting to land on the carrier. The culprit? That darned arresting cable. It turns out it had been damaged even more than the technicians thought in the latest landing attempt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The carrier's air wing was transferred ashore to continue ongoing military operations. Meanwhile, in early 2017, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the Kuznetsov would cease all operations in Syria, return to Russia, and begin a long-needed modernization program to overhaul its technical systems and extend its service by 25 years. This is where things get even more weird. You see, when ships go into dry dock for extensive upgrades, things are supposed to be safer. The environment is controlled, refittings occur on predictable, tight schedules, and crews have access to all the cranes, tools, and equipment they need to do their job properly in an ideal world. And so the Kuznetsov arrived at PD-50, one of the world's largest floating dry docks located at the 82nd Repair Shipyard in the village of Rosselyukovo, serving Russia's northern fleet based out of the neighboring port of Severomorsk, to have an invasive checkup. In the autumn of 2018, fate, karma, bad luck, or whatever you want to call it, again interrupted the Kuznetsov's regularly scheduled programming when the entire dry dock suddenly convulsed and sank into the sea, collapsing cranes onto the carrier's deck and sending shipyard workers scrambling for their lives. Somewhere along the line, the pump system that controlled the dry dock's buoyancy lost power, flooding its ballast tanks with water far in excess of their maximum point. 4 dock workers were wounded, another went missing. While certain Russian officials claimed the Kuznetsov was undamaged in the incident, other outlets were quick to report that there was now a 5-meter gash in the hull of the ship around the waterline and that the deck was supposedly opened up with intricate machinery exposed when the crane fell on it. Much to the Navy's consternation, the industrial accident looked set to delay the Kuznetsov's refit longer than anticipated. And then, a year later, in 2019, the ship caught fire again. Though Russia no longer possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate a vessel of that size after the sinking of PD-50, it had stubbornly pressed on with the tortured refit when a fire broke out during repairs to the first power unit, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky as burning diesel fuel and power cables caused a thick cloud of acrid black smoke to fill the ship's cramped corridors and increased the engulfed area 6-fold to 120 square meters. This estimate made by the Russian TASS news outlet was said to be well short of the mark. Other agencies posited that the blaze covered up to 600 square meters. 8 repairmen had to be rescued from the inferno, 1 remained unaccounted for. Most blame the fire on safety violations. It would be par for the course. The fire damage cost an estimated $8 million, although some sources cite that number may be higher. The Kuznetsov by this point had already become the brunt of international jokes in the press and military circles. Its embarrassing overhaul was only adding insult to injury. Repairs were delayed through 2021, with Russian officials citing bad weather as the chief cause. Okay, it took until May 2022 to return the ship to a new dry dock built in Murmansk after the sinking of the PD-50. When it finally drained in July 2022, repairs continued in earnest. That is until December 2022, when the ship caught fire again. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a man at sea inexplicably shoots an enormous seabird that had been flying alongside his vessel for several days. As the bird died, the wind immediately ceased blowing. Irate with the mariner and fully convinced the bird had magically made the wind blow, his crew made him wear the albatross around his neck until it rotted, a heavy burden that acted as a constant reminder of his senseless decision. By this point in the Admiral Kuznetsov's long life, an honest reading of the past 30 years would seem to indicate that the vessel, much like the mariner's albatross, is an unnecessary burden around Russia's neck. Russia seems to be blithely ignoring the chronic shortcomings, tragic losses, and damaged prestige incurred by the vessel's poor design. They remained committed to getting the ship operational sometime in 2023. Now things are looking as bad as ever as the ship, like the Albatross, seems to be decomposing at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk. A recent Defense Intelligence report indicated that even at this late stage of its refitting, the ship could not relocate from the dry dock to one of the repair plant's piers under its own power, but that it still had to be pulled by a series of several tugs. They tried and failed to move the hulking steel mass owing to the critical condition of the ship's hull. Examinations to the hull revealed that the metal structures below the third deck of the ship were significantly corroded. The holds are filled with muddy water, which makes it impossible to examine the ship in detail from the inside. Today, repairmen are warning the Russian military to deploy the Kuznetsov at their own risk. Its condition, they argue, leaves it with a high probability that it would sink or capsize. Russian naval officials, repairmen, and defense contractors are now hurling blame at one another for the vessel's dismal bill of health. Now nobody knows whether the Kuznetsov will be able to return to service in 2024 or not. This all begs the question, if it's more trouble than it's worth, why doesn't Russia simply scuttle the ship? It all goes back to the way Russia hopes the world perceives it as a global and not a regional naval power. For decades, Russia has been in the process of modernizing its surface fleet with larger numbers of smaller, technologically advanced vessels. Yet it has doggedly clung to many of its older, larger units, vestiges of the Soviet era when it was truly on the brink of becoming a major sea power. Just as Ukraine's sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was viewed globally as an attack on Russia's perception of itself as a sea power, one expert has observed that scrapping the Kuznetsov would be akin to scrapping the idea of Russia being a great sea power. This, put simply, is just not on the cards for Russia's current cast of leaders. Today, Russia can't afford to build any new large warships of consequence. Until it achieves its long-term strategic goals in Ukraine, this trend looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. In the interim, the Russian Navy will be forced to maintain and modernize its current fleet, so even though its lone carrier is prone to spontaneous combustion, puts its crew in undue danger, remains reliant on external tugs for propulsion, and occasionally forces its pilots to eject at sea, it is and will remain the golden child of the Russian fleet until its leaders see the writing on the wall. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. Russia's Su-57, Putin's first stealth fighter in service since December 2022, has been through a rollercoaster of development woes and skepticism. Yet despite its impressive tech, doubts remain about its true capabilities, especially its stealthiness. So what's the deal with its long road to completion, and can it really slip under the radar like it claims? Let's dive in. Tom Cruise is no stranger to impossible missions. For several decades, perhaps with a bit of assistance from the Hollywood special effects department, he has been fighting bad guys in fast-moving action sequences on sea, land, and in the air. In 1986, in the film Top Gun, he piloted a state-of-the-art, fourth-generation US F-14 Tomcat against fictional Russian MiG-28s. In 2022, he returned to the cockpit of the by-now out-of-date F-14 to dogfight against fifth-generation advanced Russian fighters. Cruise, in the guise of ace fighter pilot Pete Mitchell, manages to shoot down 2 enemy aircraft. He downs one of them the old-fashioned way, with a burst of cannon fire. Another member of his squadron manages to account for another one. In this second version of the film Top Gun, the plane the movie directors chose to represent the bad guys was a real aircraft, the Russian Su-57 single-seat multi-role stealth fighter. Since its original maiden flight back in 2010, this is a plane so rarely seen in the skies that it might almost be a fictional aircraft. Ironically, if Maverick and his buddies had shot down 3 Su-57s in real life, that would have probably accounted for the entire Russian serviceable fleet of stealth fighters. Joking aside, Russia's Su-57 fighter is Russia's first attempt to join a very exclusive club of nations, those that can boast a stealth fighter within their air force. Information is always a little bit hazy around Russian military equipment. We think the Su-57 officially became operational in December 2020. Until then, it was only China and the United States that had stealth fighters. The Su-57 has had a painful and protracted birthing process that has spanned decades, cost billions of rubles, and seen 2 of the aircraft written off in accidents before it was operational. It may have been used in combat against Ukraine in the last couple of years, but we only have the claims of the Kremlin and little in the way of independent confirmation. But the Su-57 certainly seems to be a high-tech and capable aircraft, and Western analysts have been taking a keen interest in its development. So why has it taken so long to develop? And is it any good? And perhaps more to the point, is it stealthy? Before we get to that, let's start with what seemed to be a promising origin story. Founded by Pavel Sukhoi in 1939, the Sukhoi Design Bureau has developed a long and proud tradition of producing combat aircraft in the service of first the Soviet Union and then Russia. Sukhoi produced fighter and ground attack aircraft during the Second World War. From 1945 onwards, the company embraced the new challenges in technologies offered by the arrival of the jet engine, producing fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Sukhoi also branched out into civilian aircraft. In 2006, the Russian government merged several aircraft companies into the United Aircraft Corporation. Sukhoi was part of this merger, alongside Mikoyan, Tupolev, Ilyushin, and several other legendary Russian aircraft designers and manufacturers. And thus the development of the Su-57 began. Here's how it went down. Almost as soon as a new piece of high-technology military equipment comes into service, designers and planners are already looking ahead and thinking about its replacement. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was looking ahead for the next generation of combat aircraft to provide the fighters of the 1990s and beyond. The concept was to have an aircraft capable of a range of tasks, able to attack targets in the air, on the land, and at sea. Experimental projects were initiated, and some fell by the wayside amid cost increases and program delays. One fighter prototype only took to the air in 2000 and was, at that point, 9 years behind schedule. The Russian Defense Ministry started afresh and in 1999 released a new set of requirements for a fighter aircraft that could, for cost reasons, replace both the MiG-29 and the Su-27, both sizable fleets of aircraft. It was intended that the aircraft should be smaller than its predecessors as well, to fit in with limited budgets. The Sukhoi development team took part in the invitation to submit proposals. It came down to a competition between Sukhoi and MiG. In April 2002, Sukhoi was selected and invited to produce prototypes, with an intended flying trial date somewhere in 2007. At the time, the aircraft design had a prototype name of the T-50. Sukhoi themselves are speculated to have used the American F-22 Raptor as a baseline guide for their design of a stealth fighter. The Sukhoi aspiration was for a family of stealth aircraft to emerge out of the Su-57 design work. Because much of the technology was very new, as the design of the aircraft proceeded, other aircraft were used as testbeds for aspects of the T-50, such as the weapons bays, engines, and flight control systems. Sukhoi made use of their own Su-27 multi-role fighter for this, and even retained some of these innovations on the Su-27 to make an upgraded Su-27. This proved so successful that the Russian Defense Ministry bought this new Su-27 version and renamed it the Su-35. The Su-35 is actually quite similar to the Su-57, apart from the stealth aspect, which the Su-57 reportedly has and the Su-35 does not. The project started to come together. The basic design was approved in 2004, and this triggered the release of more Defense Ministry funding into the project. In August 2007, the Russian Air Force announced the development was complete and that trials would soon be starting. The Soviet Union and Russia have marketed their military hardware all over the world. A fifth-generation stealth fighter aircraft would be no exception. Getting a large overseas order early on would take the financial pressures of the Su-57 project. India had bought much Russian military equipment in the past, and expressed very strong interest in acquiring the Su-57. There was talk of potential sales of 200 or 300 aircraft. A deal was signed between Russia and India in 2010. But this is where cracks literally started to emerge in the program. A dozen flying and non-flying prototypes had been produced. Although flight testing and the maiden flight were due to begin in 2007, the flights were delayed. There were problems with the engines, flying trials were pushed back to 2010, and when they did take place, it soon became apparent that the airframe structure had significant problems. Stress cracks were appearing after only a few flights. The Sukhoi designers scrambled to find solutions and had to implement some major design adjustments in order to reinforce the basic aircraft structure. In June 2014, one of the prototypes caught fire just after landing. Although the pilot escaped unharmed, the aircraft was written off. Some of the parts and components were cannibalized for use with the other prototypes. The original plan had been to start delivering production versions of the Su-57 from 2015. This clearly was not going to happen. The delivery date slipped to 2020. During these unforeseen difficulties, the Russian government began to reassess and reduce its purchasing plans for the aircraft. The Russian Defense Ministry would buy 52 Su-57s by 2020 and then another 150 by 2025. But the program remained troubled, as purchasing plans and delivery dates all fluctuated. After Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and the subsequent low-intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine fought by Russian-backed separatists and covert Russian forces, international sanctions began to impact on Russian finances. The Russian defense industry relied on importing high-tech Western electronics and other equipment. These important components became harder to access on the open market. Sanctions were to become even tougher when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. India started to back away from the big purchase order of Su-57s and in 2018 cancelled the deal completely. Large-scale production of what was a very expensive aircraft was now looking very doubtful. But in 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin jumped in to tip the scales, perhaps even with his eye on a coming war with Ukraine. In May, the Kremlin released a statement that 76 Su-57s would be bought and would be delivered by 2028, but production of the aircraft remained slow. Reportedly, one was made in December 2020, and another 4 had emerged by the middle of 2022. Despite the problems, the aircraft had now flown publicly at airshows, and analysts had been able to take a look. The aircraft was light, maneuverable, and agile. Commentators were impressed. Marketing brochures and Kremlin official statements hyped up the capabilities, not least the fact that it was a stealth aircraft with long-range strike capability. But good intelligence analysts try not to take anything for granted. If it could do everything that the brochure advertised, the Su-57 would represent a very credible opponent for current US and NATO frontline fighter aircraft, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning. But one former US pilot wryly observed, "Is it a current threat? Well, not now, because there is only one of them." Another ex-pilot observing the smooth takeoff and acrobatics of an Su-57 at an airshow was impressed but slightly dismissive of the fancy aerial display designed primarily to please the tourists. He was more interested in how the aircraft would perform with a full load of fuel and a heavy payload of weapons. Despite Putin's apparent faith in the aircraft, on December 24, 2019, the first official production-grade aircraft crashed while being delivered to an airbase. The pilot ejected and survived. The cause is unclear, but is believed to have been some form of control system malfunction. So what sort of capabilities have been advertised for the Su-57? The aircraft stats look impressive, reporting a speed of Mach 2 to 2.1 and a ceiling of 20,000 meters. A high fuel carrying capacity appears to give it a much longer range, 1,500 kilometers, just under 1,000 miles, than its Su-27 counterpart. It also has the option to fit an extendable refueling probe to further increase the range. Later production models are intended to receive a newly designed engine, the Isdalai 30, to deliver more power and performance. The Su-57 is capable of supercruise, maintaining flight speeds beyond Mach 1 without having to use high-fuel expensive afterburners. The Su-57 has 6 radars to enhance pilot situational awareness. The N-036 Bielka radar has a range of 400 kilometers. The F-16, about to be received by Ukraine, only has a range of 300 kilometers. It can carry many different permutations of weapon types, missiles, cruise missiles, and bombs, enabling it to strike at ground, sea, and air targets. A GSH 30mm automatic cannon provides a small anti-air or air-to-ground attack capability. Apparently, hypersonic missiles are being designed with the Su-57 in mind. The infrared search and tracking system can handle multiple targets. But let's spend a little bit of time thinking about the main selling point for the Su-57, its stealth capability. Inevitably, these specialist skills are closely guarded state secrets, but we can make a few observations. A stealth aircraft is simply an aircraft that has been designed to make it harder for radar to hit the aircraft and bounce back to the radar receiver and produce a ping or a blip on the radar screen. This can be achieved with several careful shaping features to the plane's outline. The Su-57 aircraft has incorporated many measures indicative of stealth capability. The wing and control surfaces are carefully shaped and angled. For stealth missions, the weapons are carried in 4 internal weapons bays, rather than hanging off the outside of the aircraft, which would make the aircraft more radar visible. Large parts of the aircraft surface are treated with radar-absorbing material, RAM. A key search and track sensor faces backwards when not in use, with the forward edge treated with RAM. The pilot canopy has been prepared with a metal oxide coating to reduce the radar profile. Extra care has been paid to every aspect of the assembly of the aircraft. Every rivet has to be flush with the fuselage or otherwise concealed. When assessing an aircraft's stealth capability, the experts talk of a radar cross-section. They mean what aircraft profile is visible to a radar system. By one estimate, the Su-57's radar cross-section, or RCS, is 30 times smaller than that of the Su-27. But some Western analysts suggest that although the frontal radar cross-section may be reasonably effective, the profile from the rear looks to be less well concealed. This would mean that it's probably harder to pick up on the radar if it's coming straight at you, but it might be more visible from the side or the rear. A crucial selling point for military hardware is whether you can point to a credible track record of military success. The Su-57 does not have this. Or does it? It's actually quite difficult to give a definitive answer. The Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that the Su-57 has been used in action in Syria and in Ukraine. This is hard to verify, but let's take a look at what we do know. Our journey begins in Syria. In late February of 2018, 2 Su-57s reportedly landed at the Khmeimim military airbase on Syria's Mediterranean coastline. Khmeimim is directly adjacent to the Bashar al-Assad International Airport and, since 2015, has been effectively handed over to the Russians as part of their military operation in support of the Assad regime. It's well defended by Russian military personnel and air defense systems, and is a key logistics and accommodation node for Russian forces. The base has come under attack from shelling and drones in 2018. The Su-57s came accompanied by other aircraft, including Su-25s and 35s. Depending on the route taken, this could have been a flight of 1,000 kilometers or so, providing a good flight trial in its own right. It's possible that another couple of Su-57s also arrived at Khmeimim a few days later. What the Su-57s did there is unclear. It may simply have been a public relations exercise to demonstrate Russian capabilities and global reach. The aircraft were only there for a few days. After they departed, the Russian government made reference in March to Su-57 combat trials in Syria and claimed on 25th of May that an Su-57 had fired a cruise missile in combat. Later that year, the Russian Defense Ministry released footage of the Su-57s in flight and stated that 10 flights had taken place. It seems highly likely that the Su-57s dipped their toes into the Syrian conflict, but overall, this looks more like a PR stunt than a serious military deployment. Okay, but what about Ukraine? Russian claims that the Su-57 has been active during the invasion of Ukraine have been more persistent, but equally difficult to prove. Although it might seem a bit of a no-brainer that the Russian military would want to use their best aircraft in a large-scale war on their border, using the Su-57 over Ukraine would be fraught with military and reputational dangers. According to estimates, there are perhaps 10 to 15 Su-57 aircraft in total. It's fair to assume that not all of these would be operationally ready at any one point in time. This amounts to a very small potential strike force, and one that could not realistically afford to lose more than 1 or 2 in combat. Multiple Russian sources started claiming that the Su-57 was used in action during the war, from 2 or 3 weeks after the start of the invasion. On 22nd of June 2022, Russian state media referred to the Su-57 combat operations in relation to Ukraine. On the 5th of November 2023, Russian media claimed that the Su-57s had been active over Luhansk, a region of Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine. Perhaps more credibly, the British Ministry of Defense Intelligence Group have assessed that the Su-57 has almost certainly been used in the war. Okay, so what could this mean? The Russian Air Force has suffered catastrophic losses during its invasion of Ukraine. According to plausible estimates, well over 300 aircraft from a Russian Air Force operational strength pre-war of around 900 aircraft. The Ukrainian air defense system has greatly improved during the conflict and now presents a very effective shield against Russian aerial encroachment. This looks likely to have caused the Russian Air Force to limit the amount of aircraft it risks to actually fly over Ukrainian territory. It is likely that US and NATO intelligence-gathering aircraft operating over NATO or international airspace in Eastern Europe are scooping up as much information as possible regarding Russian air deployment activities and operations and relaying this to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Many Russian air attacks are now conducted from Russian aircraft firing long-range missiles from Russian airspace. But even this does not make them entirely safe. Ukrainian air defense weapons include the Patriot, which has a range of 50 to 100 miles. Drones and other missiles also put Russian aircraft at risk on their bases inside Russia. So it's likely that Russia is remaining highly cautious with the Su-57 over Ukraine, not wishing to overplay their hand and expose it to undue risk. From what we've seen so far, the Su-57 is being used to undertake just enough aerial activity to be able to claim operational experience, but not enough to use it in a serious way that might knock out key Ukrainian military targets by using its stealth capability. If an Su-57 crashed in Ukraine, it would be a major propaganda blow for Russia and potentially a rich source of technological and tactical intelligence information made available to the Ukrainians and their Western allies. The views from the Ukrainian military suggest they certainly do not rule out the possibility that the Su-57 has been deployed in some way. One Ukrainian colonel observed that it's hard to identify specific aircraft types from the radar screen. The Su-25 and Su-35 can conduct similar non-stealth attacks with a similar profile. The colonel may know a little more than he's letting on. Perhaps the only real proof that a Russian stealth fighter was operating over Ukraine would be if a Ukrainian ground target suddenly exploded and the Ukrainians were at a complete loss to explain who had done it. That would be the perfect demonstration of a stealth attack. Conversely, however, if a Russian stealth attack was seen on the radar and easily intercepted, the Su-57's credibility would be instantly blown. So the question is, does Mr. Putin feel lucky? One thing's for sure, it's been a troubled path for Sukhoi's 5th-generation stealth fighter, and unfortunately for Russia's Su-57 program, it looks to be having very similar problems to the Russian T-14 next-generation main battle tank program, which we covered in one of our previous episodes. Both projects have struggled with design issues, have little to show for several decades of effort, and are now struggling with funding, technology, and a lack of crucial overseas sales. There are very few, only handfuls really, of the equipment known to be in existence, and no convincing demonstrations that either the aircraft or the tank are operationally ready in any meaningful sense. But work is still ongoing. Sukhoi is developing an Su-57 upgrade, known as the Su-57M. Flight trials of the Su-57M reportedly took place in 2022. There has been talk of a smaller naval version capable of landing on an aircraft carrier, but Russia does not have a viable carrier force at present. Perhaps of more immediate interest, in July 2021 there was reporting that a 2-seater variant of the Su-57 was being built. This was described as a training version, but also something that might provide for a weapons officer to operate unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. Drone technology is causing something of a revolution in military affairs, due in large part to the innovations emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. This is definitely something to keep an eye on. There is little concrete evidence that the international arms community have been wowed by the arrival of the Su-57. Although international sanctions are unlikely to shut down the Su-57 program, lack of critical technology, funds, and buyers will likely continue to restrict the forward progress of the Su-57 project. Potential sales opportunities still look limited. Brazil dropped out in 2013, preferring to buy the Swedish Gripen and build it in Brazilian factories. India cancelled its deal with Russia over 5 years ago and is looking to build its own homegrown stealth fighter. Turkey was briefly interested. In 2019, an Su-57 turned up at a Turkish technology display in Istanbul, but announced in early 2020 that it too was now planning to build a homegrown stealth fighter. Algeria may receive some in a few years' time, and Iraq has expressed interest, but they will probably be watching Ukraine closely for evidence of the much-promoted stealth capability. But not all technological innovations leap straight from the drawing board and into a fully functioning and successful piece of equipment. We suggest that it would be too simplistic to write off the Su-57. It is a light, powerful, and agile aircraft with significant capabilities beyond other current Russian combat aircraft. And some of the new design and technological features that emerged from Sukhoi's extensive development efforts seem to have cascaded down to the benefit of other Russian fighter systems. So perhaps we need to wait and see what happens later this year. F-16 fighters have been offered to the Ukrainian Air Force by Denmark and Norway. These will replace the aging Ukrainian MiG-29 and Su-27 fighters. Ukrainian pilots are already being trained on F-16s, and we may well see them take to the skies over Ukraine even as soon as this summer. But what do you think? Is it possible the Russian Air Force is holding back its small Su-57 fleet in anticipation of a conflict with American aircraft technology? This would suddenly take us beyond a Hollywood movie and into a real contest between American 4th-generation aircraft and Russian 5th-generation. Is this likely to happen? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The Soviet Union, and later its internationally recognized successor state, the Russian Federation, have long prided themselves on their tank forces. Russia has the world's largest armada of tanks, with a total of 12,566 units in its fleet. This is a number greater than the combined total of North Korea, 6,645, and the United States, 5,500, which come in at second and third place, respectively. So with all this pride about its supposed tank prowess, why has it been so reluctant to deploy its latest and greatest tanks to the battlefields in Ukraine? We all know about Russia's refusal to deploy its few T-14 Armata tanks into battle in Ukraine. It's afraid of losing them. However, Russia has also been hesitant to send its T-90s into combat too, and it's deployed comparatively few of them in Ukraine. Why? Is the T-90 also a tank that doesn't live up to the stories that the Russians have told about it? Or was the T-90 a marketing gimmick all along? Let's take a look at the T-90, Russia's supposedly most advanced main battle tank that it possesses in large numbers, and its less than stellar performance in combat. Russia's fleet of over 12,500 tanks is, like many things related to its military, deceptive. Of these, only about 2,600 of them are main battle tanks, and of these 2,600, only about 650, 25% of them, are T-72B3B3M, T-80BVM and T-90AM models that are outfitted with modern fire control systems. According to the Pentagon, by the beginning of 2023, Russia had lost half of the tanks it deployed since its invasion of Ukraine, thanks to their outdated designs, the armored fleet's poor logistics and doctrine, and poor leadership. The T-72 tank remains the workhorse of the Russian military, and has been the most widely deployed Russian tank to Ukraine, rather than the newer T-90. The T-90 has instead played second fiddle to its predecessor, and with good reason. This supposed modern main battle tank's origins, the design flaw it inherently carries, and how it has performed in Ukraine scream failure. Let us explain. The T-90 saw its origins in the late Soviet Union, when the Western powers were producing tanks like the Abrams, Challenger 2, and Leopard 2. Soviet tank designers were worried about this development and wanted to produce a replacement for their entire tank fleet, one which could compete with the designs their rivals were now making. However, instead of taking a page out of the West's playbook and designing an entirely new tank, the Soviets based the T-90 on a fusion of the T-72 and the T-80. As it turns out, this may not have been the best choice. The Russian machine builder Uralvagonzavod produced and built the tank, which entered service in 1992, just after the Soviet Union's collapse. It has since been upgraded with the T-90A in 2004, the T-90M in 2016, and the T-90MS in 2017. Russia probably had between 750 and 1,000 of the T-90 and all its variants on hand prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So how was this tank originally designed? Let's start with the basics. The T-90 is operated by a crew of 3. The tank also has an integrated autoloader for its 125mm cannon and a low-profile design. Its secondary weapons are 12.7mm cord-heavy machine gun and a 7.62mm PKMT belt-fed machine gun. The tank also boasts a Shatora curtain, an electrical jammer that deploys smoke grenades when a missile targets the tank. Infrared lights are also part of its defensive array, and these are designed to confuse the guidance system of an incoming tank-killing missile or rocket. The T-90 is built with reactive armor tiles, which are designed to explode when impacted by a tank-killing munition. This helps protect the tank from the full impact of an incoming round. Additionally, the T-90 is built with composite armor materials to make it more rugged against conventional ammunition and precision-guided anti-tank weapons. Unfortunately, these armor systems have often proven less than adequate, and when Russia is involved, you can expect corruption too. Just as we saw in the case of Russian body armor, Corrupt officers have had a penchant to sell off the reactive armor panels of the T-90 and other tanks because they are valuable in their own right. To replace them, the officers have installed other materials. At first, rumors went around that they had just put egg cartons onto the tank's sides. This was an easy rumor to believe, given Russia's long history of incompetence that included protecting its soldiers with the airsoft version of the Ratnik body armor. In fact, the material in question is a plastic filler called the 4S24 Softcase Era Block. Unfortunately for Russia, this is not adequate protection against modern anti-tank rounds, even if they don't just fly over it like the Javelin does. Russia has tried to develop better defenses for its existing tanks. These attempts include the Arena armor, which made some waves before the war in video demonstrations. In 2021, Russia released footage of the T-72B3 tank defending itself from an incoming RPG-7 rocket by launching an interceptor that destroyed the rocket in flight. The Arena's active protection system was responsible for this and appeared to show promise for Russia as a way to further protect its tanks without overburdening them with heavier and heavier armor. The Arena system rings the host tank with several millimeter wave radars pointed at different angles. If these radars detect an incoming threat, they will automatically launch an interceptor out of an armored silo located on the tank. Unfortunately for Russia, the Arena system proved to be just another marketing campaign and could not be deployed. The Arena system has not appeared in Ukraine at any point in the war. Operationally, the T-90 has a top road speed of 43 miles per hour and has an operational range of 310 miles. The tank weighs about 48 tons. The T-90's weight is about 20 tons less than its Western rivals. One would think this would be to its advantage. However, the additional weight of tanks like the Abrams Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 is usually put into their armor. This additional armor makes them more survivable, which is critical in a world of precision fire and where the first tank to get shot usually dies. Western tanks are simply better protected and more likely to withstand multiple hits, a fact which we've seen play out in Ukraine's campaign in Zaporizhia, where Russian weapons have often been unable to destroy them outright. Rather, these Western tanks have often been damaged in engagements with their crews surviving. They are then sent to the rear for repairs and put back in the fight. At the same time, Russian tanks, which are often exposed in an attempt to inflict disproportionate casualties on their enemy, get killed in the same engagement without adequately fulfilling the mission they were sacrificed for. Before the war in Ukraine, the T-90 had been a popular tank for international sales. International arms deliveries have been one of the few strong points in Russia's post-Soviet economy. Risking those relationships would be the last thing the Kremlin would want to do, which explains the T-90's comparative absence in Ukraine. The T-90's foreign users include Algeria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Vietnam, Syria, and above all, India, which has long had a close arms relationship with Russia and operates about 2,080 T-90 tanks. Unfortunately, performance in Ukraine is only one of the T-90's problems that questioned its prospects for further export abroad. India's experience with the T-90s has proven far from smooth. Indian T-90 tanks were spotted with the infamous cope cages near its border with Pakistan in the middle of October 2023, demonstrating that India is not entirely confident about the tank's defensive qualities, for good reason, because India has experience with faulty T-90s. For example, to fulfill one Indian order of T-90s, the Russian mounted older, less protective turrets to new hulls. Russia exported these turrets to its Indian customer anyway because it had pre-built a lot of them and didn't want to see them go to waste. These were, however, more vulnerable than newer turrets. The comparative lack of protection was not the only problem either. During tests, the Indians found that their new tanks' fire control systems and thermal imaging sites could not cope with their country's hot summer weather. To adapt the T-90 to this climate, Russian manufacturers offered to build specialized air conditioning systems for the tanks, but these also failed, and a tank driver fainted from heat stroke, which forced India to shop abroad to find ways to solve the problem. These and other issues have made India reconsider its tank relationship with Russia. As tensions between it and China mount, and Pakistan remains a constant threat, the last thing India wants is faulty tanks that would prove ineffective in combat. Indeed, the thermal sights on the T-90 for the tank's commanders have proven so bad that the Russians were secretly installing French sights. However, because of sanctions, these are no longer available. The new T-90s will come with the same Russian sights that proved so unsatisfactory in India. The T-90 compares poorly to Western main battle tanks partly because, as we said, it's basically just a variant of the older T-72, combined with some parts of the T-80, such as the Irtish fire control system, with reactive armor strapped to the chassis. The T-90 was also not designed with open architecture in mind, which means that it is a difficult tank to keep up to date with modern weapons and equipment. Case in point, the T-90's autoloader can't fire Russia's newer and larger anti-tank kinetic projectiles, the Vacuum-1 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding Sabot. These rounds were designed for the T-14 Armata, but they cannot be reverse-engineered for the T-90 or older tanks. Unfortunately for the Russians, the T-14 has never materialized on the battlefields of Ukraine, so these new anti-tank rounds, which actually pose a threat to the Abrams, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2, have also been absent from the war. If you want to know why so many Western tanks have been damaged but not destroyed, while their Russian counterparts have gone down in flames, this is one of the reasons. Another of the most glaring problems is the T-90's short effective firing range. The tank's main gun is difficult to raise to high angles. The T-90's gun can move up to a range of 14 degrees upward or 6 degrees downward, which severely limits the targets it can hit. As an example, the T-72 and T-80 tanks deployed in Chechnya proved incapable of raising their guns high enough to shoot at rebels on rooftops or behind third-story windows. These rebels destroyed many Russian tanks with anti-tank weapons, while the T-72s and T-80s proved incapable of retaliation with their main guns. Because the T-90 was based on these two tanks, it suffers from the same problems, and it's proving just as bad in tank-v-tank combat in Ukraine. Western main battle tanks like the American Abrams can hit targets up to 3 miles away, aided by greater gun mobility. In contrast to Russian tanks, the Abrams can raise its turret to an upward angle of 20 degrees, or lower it to an angle of 9 degrees, giving it greater range and flexibility. The T-90 cannot do this, so it will lose out at longer range combat. The T-90 is also comparatively deficient in its ability to puncture the armor of opposing modern Western tanks. To safely do so, it will need to get closer to its targets, while enemy tanks can stay back at safer ranges. Obviously, this reality is not advantageous for the Russian tank. Poor doctrine was literally built into the T-90's design. One of the reasons the Soviet planners chose not to go with a completely new design for the T-90 was because they wanted the tank to remain cheap, which its predecessor, the T-72, also was. The T-72 was designed to replicate World War II-era flood tactics and overwhelm its opponents with mass. This design has carried over into the T-90, where it's been implemented in Ukraine to poor results. The tank's cost hints at this purpose, as one T-90 costs roughly between $2.5 million to $4.5 million, depending on the variant, which is much less expensive than its Western counterparts. By comparison, an Abrams tank can cost over $10 million per unit, while the Leopard 2 can cost $6 million and the Challenger 2 around $5 million. This comparison in unit costs reveals the Soviet plans to flood the zone with the sheer mass of T-90s they planned to produce. Unfortunately for the Russians, this mass of T-90s never came. Russia lost much of its tank-producing infrastructure in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. The T-90 was notably absent in the First Chechen War. Instead, the T-72 and T-80 were sent into combat, where they performed poorly. By keeping the T-90 out of the fight in Chechnya, Russia was able to maintain the illusion that it was one of the world's best main battle tanks. The Kremlin went on a marketing spree, pretending there was no need to deploy one of the world's best tanks against poorly organized and equipped rebels in Chechnya. According to the Kremlin, the T-90 was above such trivialities. The marketing campaign worked because international sales of the T-90 picked up. When the T-90 did start to see combat, it performed far below the standards that Russia had made the world come to expect from it. Russia's intervention on behalf of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war quickly put the T-90 to the test. Just as quickly, footage spread on social media showing Syrian rebels destroying T-90 tanks with old Tau missiles. Bashar al-Assad's army received 30 T-90s from Russia. 5 or 6 of them were confirmed to be destroyed by wire-guided Tau-2A missiles between 2016 and 17. It was a preview of things to come in Ukraine. As early as May 2022, Ukrainian troops proved capable of killing the T-90 with a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle in Kharkiv Oblast. This was the first confirmed kill of a T-90 during the war, According to the Oryx blog, Russia has 2,458 visually confirmed tank losses since the war in Ukraine began. Of these, 90 are T-90 tanks. 34 of the losses are of the T-90A, 1 is a T-90AK, 7 are T-90S tanks, and 48 are T-90M tanks. This data is current as of November 5, 2023. One contributor to these losses is the fact that the T-90 comes with a design that stores its ammunition inside the tank compartment. Once the vehicle takes a direct hit, it and its crew will be blown sky high. Russian tank turrets getting sent skyward in explosions have been a common feature circulating on social media footage taken by Ukrainian soldiers. While most of these tanks have been T-72s, the T-90 is no exception and has met the same fate many times. In October 23, spectacular footage taken by a drone circulated showing a T-90 getting totaled by an anti-tank round in Ukraine. The way Russia has used its tanks has not done it any favors and has instead compounded their design flaws. Russia has repeatedly failed to coordinate its armor with its infantry and artillery, often moving armored columns independently of the other branches of its military. Russian tank crews also tend to be poorly trained. Because Russia has lost tanks at high rates with their crews getting killed in the process, Russian tankers tend to be inexperienced. However, even if Russia managed to find a way to fix these deficiencies, the fact is that its tanks are outdated and incapable of standing up to modern Western armor and anti-tank tactics or equipment. And because Russian tanks like the T-90 are obsolescent designs that are not adapted for open architecture, the Kremlin cannot upgrade its tank fleets like its Western rivals can. In particular, the inability for the T-90s and its older siblings to use the new Vacuum 1 round has put them behind the 8-ball when it comes to dealing with the modern tanks that Ukraine is now fielding. The lack of open architecture is especially bad news for a Russia that lacks the means to create an adequate replacement tank for its older vehicle, as seen in the failure of the T-14 Armata program. After a decade, only a handful have been built, and sanctions mean that it will be challenging for Russia to get the parts it needs to build more of them. As the T-90 and its older siblings get depleted, Russia has been forced to rely on even older designs like the T-62 and T-54-55. With the steady losses of T-90s, T-80s and T-72s, Russia's tank force has gotten proportionally more outdated, while Ukraine's has gotten proportionally more modern thanks to the aid of its Western allies. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that the Russians seem to have surged the T-90 into combat in recent weeks. T-90 losses have accelerated as Ukraine gains more ground in Zaporizhia, which may demonstrate that Russia has more T-90 tanks on hand and is no longer willing to hold them back from action. Russian factories seem to be producing more T-90s. However, these are still, by their nature, obsolescent designs, and for Russia there seems to be no way out of this conundrum. Even though Ukraine still mostly uses the older, Soviet-era tanks, its arsenal steadily gets more advanced. Germany has announced it will deliver 14 more Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine in early 2024 to replace some of the units Ukraine has lost in recent weeks of fighting in its Zaporizhia offensive. Russia, meanwhile, has no choice but to continue depleting its arsenal and hope that it will be able to bleed more than its enemy will. For all the talk about how advanced it is, the T-90 is merely the latest expression of Russia's traditional way of war, using sheer mass to take more punishment than the enemy can until exhaustion sets in. That was, after all, what the T-90 was designed to do, despite Russia's pretensions to the contrary when selling the tank abroad. The T-90 is far from one of the world's premier main battle tanks. It is instead set into a fixed, obsolete pattern, unable to adapt to the modern battlefield and ineffective against even armed rebels with adequate anti-tank equipment, let alone organized Western armies with top-of-the-line equipment. Russia may be able to win through attrition in Ukraine using these tanks as part of the program, but it will come at a high price for little gain and the loss of much of its effective land power. The tank fleet has long been Russia's pride and joy, but in Ukraine, it's getting beaten at its own game and will emerge with far less capability than it had before the invasion began. The T-90 had a lot of hype going into the conflict, but that was all. In the war's aftermath, no matter how it ends up, Russia will have far fewer main battle tanks to call on in any future conflict or to present an effective land deterrent. But what do you think about the T-90 and its results in Ukraine? Is there anything that Russia could have or still can do differently? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more military analysis from military experts. Once a force to be reckoned with in the global arms trade, Russian weaponry has seen a significant shift. What's behind the decline in Russian arms exports, and who has risen to become the world's second largest arms dealer? And can you guess who's still holding the top position? At the height of the Cold War, one of the major indices of Soviet power was the quantity of arms it exported to the rest of the world. Whether propping up an associate in one of many ongoing proxy wars, bolstering the strength of a member of the Warsaw Pact, or reinforcing the rise of Third World tyrants-to-be, there always seemed to be a willing market for the stockpiles of unused Kalashnikovs, MiGs, and T-62s, crowding the Soviet Union's many surplus depots. When the USSR collapsed in the early 90s, however, Russian arms exports went into sharp decline. Under the leadership of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the country experienced a temporary resurgence in arms sales throughout the 2000s and 2010s. This upward trend coincided with more frequent military interventions outside Russia's borders, especially in places like Georgia in 2008 and Syria in 2015. Smack dab in between these two conflicts, Russian arms exports peaked in 2011, when the country virtually matched American arms exports, rifle for rifle, shell for shell, and tank for tank. It did $8 billion worth of deliveries to 35 different countries in that 1 year alone. For a moment, it looked like Putin really was recapturing the type of geopolitical influence enjoyed by his Soviet forebears. Then in 2014, Putin invaded Ukraine and, well, things started to fall apart. Over the past decade, Russia has witnessed a precipitous decline in arms exports, which by some estimates has contracted as much as 70%. Some analysts call the waning profits and the subsequent loss of prestige one of the many casualties of Russia's war in Ukraine. If the war in Ukraine is partially to blame, it doesn't look like things are going to change anytime soon. Russia can ill afford to export arms to eager buyers around the world if it can barely keep up its own staggering vehicle and equipment losses in Ukraine. The longer the war stagnates, the more equipment Russia will be forced to throw into the meat grinder. The more equipment it consumes, the less there is on the table for Russia to export. It might be simple maths, but it's also a damning equation for the Russian arms industry. Naturally, one man's problem is another man's opportunity. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been an almost immutable balance in global arms exports between the United States, the biggest seller of global arms worldwide, and the Soviet Union, whose mix of high-end aircraft, air defense, and battle tanks, as well as reliable, durable, and cheap small arms weapons, found ready buyers the world over. Now that Russia's declining arms exports have left a vacuum in the marketplace, other arms sellers are eager to fill the void. In fact, in 2021 and 22, Russia was finally surpassed by another nation as the second largest arms dealer on planet Earth. Just who that is might surprise you. Today, let's explore what effect the collapse of the Russian arms industry might have on its near and long-term geopolitical and economic prospects, and what Russia's performance in Ukraine might mean for prospective buyers around the globe. It's a demonstrable and somewhat jarring fact that today, the once vaunted Russian military, with its endless reserves of military materiel, is now more dependent on arms sales to China and India than any time since 2003, but at much smaller export volumes, and with both India and China continuing to develop their own import-competing arms industries. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic outlook in Russia looked pretty bleak. Russia had one ace up its sleeve, however. China was experiencing stupendous growth, and as it had during the Cold War, relied heavily on Russian arms sales to sharpen the sword of its growing military, until its own GDP, industry, and global industry had reached rough parity with the United States. Between 1990 and 1999, Russia reinvigorated its status itself as a major arms seller on the global stage, with a torrent of cheap equipment sales to China and its rapidly growing neighbor India. Military experts have argued that while Russia's arms deals never amounted to more than a small portion of Russia's annual trade exports, between 2 to 5% overall, it has relied on weapon sales as a metric of soft power, a way to build patronage networks and advance its economic and strategic objectives around the globe. This worked with former Soviet states and power-hungry dictators and revisionist rogue leaders like Syria's Bashar al-Assad and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, but it also worked especially well with Chinese and Indian leaders who could afford to infuse their military power with the more expensive systems Russia had on offer. There's a reason why the strength of Russia's arms exports have almost become synonymous with the strength of its global military partnerships and alliances. Once you buy a high-tech weapon system from another nation, you essentially lock yourself into a dependability cycle for the long haul. Former US Assistant Secretary of State Andrew Shapiro likened this binding process to the act of buying a modern smartphone. When someone buys a smartphone, they're not simply buying a piece of hardware. They are buying a system that includes the operating system, the system's software for email, photos, and music, as well as access to many other available applications. Therefore, an individual is in fact entering into a relationship with a particular smartphone company over the life of that phone. Similarly, when a country buys a fighter jet or other advanced defense systems from a foreign company, they are not just getting the hardware. They are buying a larger system, one that will need to be updated and repaired throughout its lifespan, which in the case of a fighter jet can be as long as 40 years. This means that in purchasing the hardware, the buyer is actually committing to a broader, long-term relationship with the United States. This helps explain why it's been so hard for certain countries to denounce Russia over the past 2 years, despite the illegality of its invasion of Ukraine. Just look at India, whose military stocks are 70 to 80% composed of Russian-made equipment. When a nation becomes majorly dependent on foreign arms exports, it becomes exponentially harder to alter the course without severely impairing one's own defense capabilities in the short term. It costs a lot of money too. Historically at least, inasmuch as Russia's military could demonstrate its effectiveness on the global stage, it could convince buyers and buyers-to-be that their equipment was worth purchasing. Since its botched invasion of Afghanistan, a spate of successful, smaller-scale interventions effectively filled this role, building global confidence in the reliability and utility of Russian weapons systems. Then in 2014, things started to change. Russia informally invaded Ukraine after the Maidan protests, inviting economic sanctions from the West as well as geopolitical pressure on Third World countries to no longer purchase Russian arms. Between 2013 and 2017, Russia enjoyed a share of between 1/4 and 1/5 of global arms exports and more than 35 customers worldwide. Between 2018 and 2022, that number contracted by 1/3, leaving Russia with just 16% of global arms exports and a mere 12 customers. Fast forward to Putin's special military operation, and Russian arms sales reached their nadir. He simply could not afford to sell the systems he soon realized he would need to maintain Russia's stranglehold on what it conquered after February 2022. That year, Russia managed $2.82 billion in arms sales, a paltry sum compared to the nearly $8 billion it was selling a decade prior. Today, France, of all countries, has stepped into the void and has surpassed Russia as the world's second-largest arms exporter, with China taking the bronze in third place. The invasion of Ukraine has cruelly exposed the quality of high-grade and cheap Russian weapon systems alike, like a store's customers passing on discounted bargain bin goods because they can clearly see the product's defects. Russian customers were undoubtedly disturbed by not only the inefficient organization and employment of Russian weapons systems in Ukraine, but the exposure of glaring technical defects and design flaws that resulted in so many tank turrets being hurled into orbit. Russia had to temporarily replace armored losses with new, old-stock BTR-80s, BMP-1s and 2s, and those archaic T-62s themselves, 10 years older than the first Ford Mustang. The fact that Russia's long-anticipated Armata, Boomerang, and Kurganets fighting vehicles have also failed to make an appearance on the battlefields of Ukraine is equally worrying, as it reveals broader industrial bottlenecks that reflect poorly on Russia's ability to deliver what it promises over the long term. Back in 2015, Russia said there would be 1,000 T-14 Armatas in service by 2025. By 2024, that means there should at least be some T-14s in service, right? Yet today, there is still no production line for the Armata, and few, if any, are in the Russian ground forces service. Videos of Russian soldiers complaining of badly rusted rifles, poorly maintained artillery shells, and unserviceable logistics vehicles have also been aired on Telegram and other social media platforms since the conflict began, speaking to the dilapidated state of Russian war materiel. Conversely, think of the benefits reaped by American arms dealers who are receiving real-time endorsements for state-of-the-art weapons being used against a near-peer threat for the first time. The poster child in this example is clearly America's HIMARS system, which has proven so effective in Ukraine that Taiwan, Poland, and Australia have not only put in for a new wave of orders, but Germany, yes, Germany, recently agreed to conduct a joint project with Lockheed Martin to create its own version of the platform. It's clear that Russia's customers are beginning to see the writing on the wall. If they are serious about their own defense, they should probably look elsewhere. Many are beginning to recognize that Russia's own defense needs will constrain its ability to fulfill its long-term arms orders. This at least was the conclusion of Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who in the aftermath of Russia's November 2022 withdrawal from Kherson, expressed Serbia's need to create its own future with regards to its military capabilities. Armenia recently jumped ship too, criticizing Russia's failure to deliver the goods or offer meaningful support in its war with Azerbaijan. So, when you account for the decreasing dependence of India and China on Russian arms exports over the past decade, the destabilizing nature of events like the COVID-19 pandemic, and the poor showing of Russian weapons systems in the ongoing war in Ukraine, you can see why Russian arms exports have taken such a big hit. Today, Russia has an intractable problem. Though it still has plenty of Soviet surplus left over from the Cold War, its foreign customers are increasingly aware of Russia's inability to maintain these aging systems or prevent their descent into obsolescence. Likewise, as Russia becomes even more isolated on the global stage, sanctions will restrict access to advanced technologies and components it needs to produce sophisticated weapons. These include the optical systems, bearings, machine tools, engines, and microchips, which have notoriously gone missing throughout Russia. These limitations will undoubtedly affect the competitiveness of Russia's arms in the global market, as arms manufacturers prioritize the restocking and rehabilitation of lost or damaged equipment in Ukraine. There have, for instance, been reports in the Russian media that certain arms manufacturers failed to deliver artillery systems for Vietnam or aircraft for Algeria on time. According to a recent CSIS study, in a radical turn of events, Russia has now begun to try to purchase back much-needed military components and technology from countries such as India and Myanmar. Russian tank manufacturers in late 2022 were importing $24 million worth of components simply to cope with requests to modernize telescopic sights and cameras on old models pulled from storage. The more these cases compound, the more Russia's traditional customers will be forced to diversify their suppliers. Vietnam, who has started courting other American, European, and Asian nations to source its military hardware, is one good example. The passage of the 2017 CAATSA Act by the US Congress in the aftermath of Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea has also contributed to the decline in Russian arms sales. The act imposed secondary sanctions on countries who engage in significant transactions with Russia's defense sector. Reinvigorated after the 2022 invasion, CAATSA has disincentivized many recent customers from making Russian weapon orders, adding to the woes of Russia's defense industry. Here's the hard data. As of late 2023, Turkey had a deal in place to buy a series of S-400 SAM systems that has since been put on hold. A deal for 16 Mi-17 helicopters made by the Philippines has since been cancelled. Russia did not make a single delivery to Egypt in 2022. Between 2018 and 2022, combat aircraft and helicopters accounted for roughly 40% of Russian arms sales. By the end of 2022, it had contracted out only 84 compared to 1,371 aircraft and helicopters ordered for the United States and 210 for France. There were only 13 pending deliveries for SAMs by late 2023. There were only 444 pending deliveries for tanks. Serbia cancelled its order of 2 Ka-32 helicopters owing to Western sanctions and war-related shortages. In 2022, Russia lost the markets of Greece, Cyprus, Finland, and a series of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, despite their historical reliance on Soviet and Russian-style systems and repair services. It's customary for nations at war to invest heavily in R&D, refine and improve existing weapon systems, and thus gain an edge over the enemy. Russia's declining arms export profits will severely limit its defense industry's long-term ability to innovate. Instead of advancing the development of its fifth-generation fighters, the Su-57 and Su-75, Russia has had to focus on ensuring it can maintain and replace its current fleet of second, third, and fourth-generation fighter aircraft. As it does so, it will continue to fall behind countries like China, whose R&D expenditures far outmatch Russia's in most categories. If it cannot afford to innovate, Russia runs the risk of repelling additional customers. It's a self-fueling cycle. Today, half of Russia's total arms exports are aircraft: MiG-29s, Su-27s, Su-30s, Su-35s, and Yak-130 jets doled out to Vietnam, China, India, Algeria, and Egypt. CAATSA sanctions have made it nearly impossible for Russia to find buyers for its most advanced offering, the Su-35, a plane it describes as a fourth-generation plus model, owing to the extent of its modifications and modern capabilities. China and more recently Iran are the only markets willing to buy, but Russia can hardly produce enough to warrant a serious bid. Even before the war in Ukraine, Russia only produced 5 Su-35s in all of 2021. Engines are a big part of Russian exports too, accounting for around 32% of its entire arms trade by late 2023. Russian-made engines extend the service life of Russian military aircraft, especially those currently employed by the Chinese Air Force. Lately, China has looked askance at Russia's ability to deliver the goods on its engine orders. It should surprise no one, but Russia has been struggling to fulfill its engine production quotas because, you guessed it, it relied heavily on Ukrainian manufacturers such as Motor Zich and Zarya Mashprojekt, which used to provide key components in Russia's engine production. According to several analysts, it's likely that the 2022 sanctions regime will further limit the Kremlin's ability to build high-quality aircraft engines in the foreseeable future, forcing China to take concrete steps towards the indigenization of the engine industry. Could these shortcomings lead to engine trouble for the broader Sino-Russian military alliance? The further you go down the list, the more Russia's issues compound. Russian manpads, anti-aircraft, and guided anti-tank missiles have always been safe purchases for Russia's faithful customers. Yet since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia has lost hundreds of its own expensive air defense systems and has struggled to maintain the defense industrial capacity required to replace them. Hence, Moscow has to import from China. Russia has lost more than 2,000 tanks in Ukraine, roughly two-thirds of its entire fleet by some estimates, which has put severe pressure on its primary tank manufacturer, Uralvagonzavod, to replace them. It has 444 tanks on order, but this is far less than the 634 pending delivery from the United States, the 717 pending delivery from China, and the 990 pending delivery from the new boy on the block, South Korea. It's now been almost half a decade since Russia made any notable exports of large naval vessels. Smaller cruisers and patrol ships occasionally come off the line, but Russia's shipbuilding and submarine industry have been forced to work under similar constraints as Western sanctions limit their access to Western components. PR from the sinking of the Moskva and other ships didn't help either. Today, the Russian shipbuilders receive more acclaim for their capacity to produce peerless sunken reefs than their ability to manufacture safe and effective military vessels. Arms exports were once one of the few areas Russia could claim geopolitical parity with the West. No longer. Not only has it fallen behind the United States defense industry over a remarkably short span, it's now witnessing one-time customers like India and China diversifying their sourcing of military equipment and expanding their own arms export capabilities. Putin can expect Russia's arms industry to constrict even further as long as it forges ahead with the long-term occupation of Ukraine. Back in May 2022, Ukrainian officials in Kyiv came up with an ingenious idea. They would take the hulks of burned-out Russian tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft, and infantry fighting vehicles and put on a sort of public exhibition in Mikhailivska Square. In August, an even larger exhibition was held on Kyiv's central Khreshchatyk Street, this time a display of more than 80 destroyed and captured tanks, howitzers, rocket artillery, and other systems. The destroyed equipment not only served as an important symbol of Ukrainian resistance in the early days of the invasion, it also reflected Ukraine's brilliant use of information warfare. For as we now know, the exhibition was not only a referendum of Russia's ineffective military, but a warning to potential purveyors of its once respected offerings. Buyer beware. So what do you think? Will Putin eventually be able to bounce back when it comes to arms trade? What strategies do you think he will try to employ to revitalize Russia's arms export industry and regain its former prominence? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. How incompetent can Putin get? Since the war in Ukraine started, he's been losing tanks by the dozens on a daily level. His military has been unable to deliver powerful air and artillery strikes or apply modern military tactics and strategies. And the list doesn't stop there. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention was naturally riveted on the land war. There, Russia's poor command structure and logistical incompetence became apparent within the first week, with the attack on Kyiv stalling. Since then, Russia has been forced to take hundreds of thousands of casualties in a war of attrition that has raged for 20 months and counting. However, Russia's incompetence has extended to the seas as well. In the build-up to the conflict and early stages of the war, military observers feared that Russia would quickly take control of the seas and stage an amphibious attack on Odessa, Ukraine's third largest city. If Russia took Odessa, it would essentially cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea entirely and leave it a poor, landlocked rump state. Such fears proved unfounded. A landing near Odessa never came. Instead, the biggest stories involving Russia's navy in this war have been of its numerous humiliations. What happened? Today, Russia has essentially ceded control of the western Black Sea and is increasingly not even safe within its haven in Crimea. But why has the Russian navy proven so ineffective in the war? To be as fair as we can to Russia, it is and always has been in a bad geostrategic position with regards to the sea. Ever since the days of Peter the Great, Russia has aspired to be a sea power. However, geography makes this difficult to do, as its ports are either contained within choke points, freeze over in the winter, or both. The quest for improved access to the sea has been a vital objective for Russia's foreign policy since the early 18th century, and Russia has never quite been able to achieve this goal. Even at the height of its power during the Soviet Union, unrestricted access to the sea was an objective that still eluded Moscow. In this light, it is understandable why Russia places such a high strategic importance on Crimea, and why it was willing to use military force to secure it. It is one of Russia's few warm water ports. Unfortunately for the Russians, there's a problem. The Turks command the transit points between the Black and Mediterranean seas through their control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This control was formalized through the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits. The convention allows complete freedom of transit for the commercial vessels of any country through these straits during peacetime. In times of war, however, Turkey, if it is not a party to the conflict, can close the straits to transiting ships unless they are returning to their bases. 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention's wartime provisions for the first time, refusing Russian naval vessels in the Mediterranean access to the Black Sea. For example, at the end of November 2022, 2 Russian warships left the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal after 9 months of idling after Turkey forbid them from transiting through the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the Black Sea. The effect of the Montreux Convention has been to cut off Russia's ability to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. For Ukraine, this was a significant piece of diplomatic aid. It immediately made Russian naval officers more cautious, knowing that every ship in the fleet was precious. Even so, it seemed far-fetched that Ukraine would be able to significantly impede the operations of the Russian Black Sea fleet. That opinion quickly started to change, however. Ukraine proved its ability to strike at the Russian navy early in the war. 3 days after it invaded Ukraine, and on the same day the Turks invoked the Montreux Convention, Russia captured the strategically important port of Berdyansk. The Ukrainian military and Western observers were understandably concerned that the Russian ships that piled into Berdyansk could either land troops in the rear of Ukraine's southern lines or attack Odessa. Then, at about 7:45 a.m. on March 24th, exactly a month after the invasion, the landing craft Saratov mysteriously exploded and sank in port at Berdyansk. Ships of the Saratov's class, the Alligator-class tank landing ship, can land up to 425 soldiers or marines, with armored support of either 40 infantry fighting vehicles or 20 tanks. The loss of this vessel was thus a significant blow to Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations. How did this happen? From the beginning of the conflict, NATO has provided Ukraine with excellent intelligence, and Ukraine's intelligence units got the word that the Saratov was loaded with munitions at the time of the attack. Ukraine used this intelligence and a Cold War-era Tochka-U Scarab short-range ballistic missile to carry out the deed. The Tochka-U has a range of about 120 kilometers. We do not know how many of these missiles Ukraine used in the attack, but what is known is that Russia's modern air defense systems should have easily been able to intercept these Soviet weapons. Russian media at the time reported that its forces had done just that, although the real story came in July, when the Saratov was raised from the depths of the sea. Russia's supposedly modern air defense network failed to act against a much older weapon system. Meanwhile, 2 other ships, the Seyza-Kurnikov and Novocherkassk, were seen on video departing from the flaming Saratov. They also suffered damage in the attack and were forced to retreat to Crimea. 11 sailors on board the Saratov died in the incident. Ukraine's next assault on the Russian navy would become the most famous of the war. This was the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April 2022. This incident was apparently so humiliating for Russia that its Ministry of Defense still offers no details about what happened and avoids talking about it in public, to the point that the families of the sailors on board are still left in the dark about the fates of their loved ones. How exactly this incident unfolded is still unclear. After the successful attack, American sources reported that the Ukrainians had used liquid-fueled Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, sending them to coordinates provided by US intelligence by way of a P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft that flew out of Italy and looked around the Black Sea. Ukraine denied this report, however. According to the Ukrainians, April 13, 2022 was the worst day to sink the cruiser because the weather was so bad for such a precise, premeditated attack. The coastline was covered with low, dark rain clouds on that day. The Ukrainian radars in the area had a limited 18-kilometer range because of the bad weather. Knowing this, the Moskva's crew got a wee bit careless. According to Ukrainian sources, at the time of the invasion we had no over-the-horizon radars and Russia knew it. But since the clouds were very low and a signal in this corridor between the water and the clouds had nowhere to go, the radar suddenly reached and identified Moskva. The ship's crew seemingly ignored this potentially deadly situation and were so lax about their security that the air defense systems were inactive. They had not noticed that they had just sailed to within the Neptune's 200-kilometer range. Ukraine may have at this point used a Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone to distract the Moskva and then launch the missiles. For a while after the attack, Ukrainian crews did not know what happened, but radar soon revealed that 4 Russian ships were rushing to the Moskva from different directions. Later, the Ukrainians realized that a tugboat had also been dispatched from Crimea, hoping to save the ailing ship. At this point, the weather cooperated again too, when a storm began at sea and made rescue operations much harder. It became impossible to save the Moskva then, and it sank beneath the waves. Hundreds of Russian sailors reportedly saw their flagship get hit by 2 Neptune missiles. The Moskva incident is more baffling because the ship was an air defense cruiser. If running properly, the Moskva should have gotten as much as 4 minutes of warning that the Ukrainian cruise missiles were on their way. The Russian cruiser also had a triple layer of protection against such air attacks. Its defenses included the S-300F surface-to-air missiles, 9K-33 OSA air defense missiles, AK-360 close-in 30mm cannons, chaff, decoys, and electronic defense systems. However, no one recorded the Moskva using any of these systems against the Ukrainian cruise missiles. The ship just sat there. Why were none of these systems active? Was the ship's radar system defective? We might never know the answer. Whatever the reason, the Moskva was the largest Russian vessel sunk since World War II, and the first loss of a Russian flagship since the Russo-Japanese War. Russia says that 18 crew members died. Other sources say it was as many as 600. Either way, the incident shocked the Kremlin. With Ukraine's demonstrated anti-ship capabilities and no way for it to bring replacements thanks to the Turks' invocation of the Montreux Convention, Russia became even more cautious about how it would use its naval assets. Since this incident, the Black Sea Fleet has been bottled up around its base in Sevastopol, Crimea. With this knowledge, Ukrainian troops confidently strode forward with their Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022, safe in the knowledge that the Russian Navy would not be bothering them with missile attacks from the Black Sea, let alone amphibious operations behind their lines. Even with the Russian Navy's retreat to the relatively safe Crimea, Ukraine wasn't done showing off its prowess in sinking ships. Next up was the rescue tug Vasily Bek. While far less spectacular a target than the Moskva, these tugs are important to the maintenance of a naval fleet. This role is especially important in the Black Sea due to Russia's inability to reinforce its fleet. This ship was new too, being launched in 2016 and commissioned in 2017. On June 17, 2022, Ukrainian forces attacked the Vasily Bek when it was on its way to resupply Russian soldiers stationed on Snake Island, a place already made famous from the start of the war, when the garrison there used colorful language in response to Russia's demands for surrender. The Ukrainians hit the Vasily Bek with 2 Harpoon anti-ship cruise missiles. The ship stood no chance and went down, with about 10 Russian KIA in the incident and a $25 million Tor air defense system on board that was supposed to be placed on the island. On June 30th, Russia evacuated its garrison from Snake Island. Moscow claimed that this move was an act of goodwill in recognition of a humanitarian corridor that was part of its grain export deal with Ukraine. In reality, Russia evacuated its troops from Snake Island because the attack on the Vasily Bek made its military brass realize that it's too risky to reinforce and resupply the outpost. It was a tacit admission that Russia had ceded the Black Sea west of Crimea to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians weren't done yet. The Olenegorsky Gornyak, a Rapucha-class landing ship, was Ukraine's next target. On August 4, 2023, Ukraine used drone boats to swarm the ship and its neighbors when it was docked in the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Not all the drones made it through Russian defenses, but the attack on the Olenegorsky Gornyak succeeded. The ship did not sink, but it needed to be put in a dry dock to repair the heavy damage. It's unlikely that the ship will return to action anytime soon. The water drone Ukraine used in the attack was a new low-visibility grey boat that can be operated via remote control. The drone boat has a high payload, able to carry a 300-kilogram warhead up to a range of 800 kilometers. The boat also features a satellite communications array at its rear. A Ukrainian operator of these drones explained their low profile was designed to exploit weaknesses in Russian ship defenses. It was an adaptation from their earlier attacks, where Russian ships spotted drone boats and sank them with artillery and small arms fire once they got to within visual range. The attack on the Olenegorsky Gornyak reveals that Ukraine has absorbed these lessons and is adapting with its newer drone boats. Russia claims that it foiled a similar attack on an oil facility after this incident, but as always, these claims should be treated with skepticism. Most recently, Ukraine attacked targets in Sevastopol, the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and other targets in Crimea. On September 13th, Ukrainian forces struck the Sergo-Ordzhonikidze shipyard in Sevastopol, a major repair base. Ukraine reportedly used 10 Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles in the attack. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that air defense systems in the area shot 7 of these missiles down, but that effort was clearly not enough. The Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine Rostov-on-Don and the large landing ship Minsk were struck and destroyed by the Storm Shadows. Key infrastructure on the base was also damaged in this incident. However, the missile attack was only the climax of the operation. Other units were essential for shaping it. Prior to the attack, Ukrainian special operators seem to have destroyed one of Russia's nearby S-400 air defense systems and took control of an oil facility that housed a local radar unit. By downing these systems, the Ukrainians set the stage for the strike on Sevastopol. It would only be the first of several attacks on Crimean targets in the weeks ahead. On September 14th, Ukraine again struck at the Russian Navy on the seas. Its general staff said it had targeted 2 ships in the western Black Sea and released a video showing a Russian patrol ship appearing to come under attack by drone boats. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that one of its ships, the Sergei Kotov, had been attacked, but repelled the assault. Meanwhile, that same day, Ukrainian forces used cruise missiles and drones to destroy a Russian air defense network in the Crimean city of Yevpatoria. Then, on September 22nd, Ukraine launched another attack on Sevastopol. Ukraine sent several Storm Shadow cruise missiles at targets there. Russia claims that it shot most of them down, but one made it through, hitting the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters. The attack set the main building ablaze, and Russian officials said at least one service member went missing in the aftermath. Ukraine alleges that the strike was timed to coincide with a meeting of high-level Russian officials. Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, says that 2 Russian commanders were badly injured in the attack. Later, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said the strike had killed Viktor Sokolov, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, along with 33 others. No independent source verified this claim, however. Sokolov reportedly attended a soccer awards ceremony to prove he was not dead on September 27th, although there are claims that this was a duplicate. As always, we should know more in time. What we do know is that the Institute for the Study of War confirmed an attack on the 744th Communications Center of the Command of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And the problems are only piling on for Russia. In late September, the Biden administration seemingly finally gave Ukraine what it has wanted for so long. Although it was not officially announced, it's likely that Ukraine will be getting ATACMS missiles in the near future. These weapons can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away, 50 kilometers further than the Storm Shadow. And unlike the Storm Shadow, which requires a riskier launch from a fighter jet, ATACMS can be fired from Ukraine's HIMARS platforms on the ground. ATACMS would be ideal for launching attacks on Sevastopol. Meanwhile, if Ukraine gets ATACMS, it's also possible that Germany will agree to supply Ukrainians with Taurus air-launched cruise missiles that have even greater range than ATACMS. This weapon system would be ideal for targeting the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. A drone attack already damaged the Kerch Bridge a year ago. This scenario would be far more threatening. Ukraine has renewed its attacks on Crimea for a few reasons. First, Russia has allowed the grain export deal that Turkey and the UN brokered in July 2022 to expire. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has resumed its blockade of such exports, making it a more important target for Ukraine to destroy. Crimea is also the linchpin of Russia's logistics in Ukraine. Being able to resupply its troops from Crimea is vital to the Russian war effort. Ukrainian disruption of Russian Navy logistics from Crimea is one of the reasons why Moscow now considers it too dangerous to send ships to the west of the peninsula. An attack on Russia's ports in Crimea would disrupt the supply chain to all the branches of Russia's military, and it appears that the Black Sea Fleet is helpless in stopping such attacks. Crimea is also a highly political target, with Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. The recapture of Crimea would be the greatest victory for the Ukrainian military, a highly symbolic measure of its triumph. The stakes are just as high, or even higher, for Putin. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, he sold his occupation and annexation of Crimea to the Russian public as his crowning foreign policy achievement. If Russian occupation of Crimea becomes untenable through missile and drone attacks, and supplying the Russian forces in other parts of Ukraine from Crimea also becomes untenable, Putin's political position at home erodes, and the entire Russian war effort risks breaking down. The war has already put Russia through isolation, economic hardship, and hundreds of thousands of casualties. If Russia cannot gain anything from the hostilities and winds up losing Crimea too, or if it at least cannot use the peninsula for strategic purposes, it's difficult to see how Putin would be able to remain in power, which he plans to do until at least 2036. In this scenario, Russian elites may decide that the time is right for their country to finally get a new leader. There is a presidential election in Russia in 2024. Although elections in Russia are only formalities, the 2024 election could serve as a pretext to oust Putin from power if the war goes too poorly between now and then. It's understandable why Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet would become an increasingly high priority for Ukraine. All wars are first and foremost political. Even if things don't turn out that way, Ukraine's effective neutralization of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is an astounding military achievement. Early in the war, Ukraine forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat to what it believed was the safety of Crimea. Now, through the actions of its intelligence units, special operators, and missile and air units, it's showing that not even Crimea is safe. If ATACMS and Taurus missiles soon arrive, that point will only be made clearer. What do you think will come next in the war at sea? Will Ukraine soon use ATACMS missiles to destroy Russian ships and docks in Sevastopol? Is the Kerch Bridge safe for Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. This is Russia's next-generation tank, the T-14 Armata, the latest tank from a country that has long prided itself on its armored assets. The T-14 is supposed to be armed with all the latest modern weapons, gadgets, and protective armor, in an ensemble meant to be a clear break from Soviet-era tank conventions which stretch back to World War II's revered T-34. Russia sells the T-14 as being in a league of its own, with capabilities that exceed all tanks of foreign manufacture. Indeed, the tank and the chatter around it gave Western observers the chills for a while. However, this facade is probably not all it's cracked up to be. Here's why Russia's next-generation T-14 Armata sucks when it actually comes to winning wars. Work on the project began in 2010 under the label Object 195. The first basic model of the new tank was introduced in July 2012. The Kremlin publicly unveiled this model as the T-14 Armata at a Victory Day parade in 2015, and the tank is supposed to enter full service by 2024. The Armata has, however, suffered multiple delays throughout its brief history. Thus far, only a single T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine. The sighting came in the village of Mijinskaya in Luhansk Oblast on October the 8th. The unit may have been placed there to serve as a command tank for other Russian armored assets. The Russians may also be deploying the T-14 tank as a psychological operation to increase morale on their own side after having experienced embarrassing defeats, and to send a message to the Ukrainians that they have yet to best their top-line gear. But how top-line is the Armata really? Would it really make a difference in Ukraine and change Russia's ebbing fortunes if it were deployed in greater numbers? On the surface, the T-14 possesses formidable attributes. It has frontal base armor protection protection of over 900 mm in combination with Malachit explosive reactive armor and the Afghani active protection system. If its armor system works as advertised, the T-14 should be able to take hits from any known tank munition, and with Ukraine's lack of advanced tanks, this could prove a problem should the Armata get deployed in large numbers. The T-14's armor is also supposedly resistant against handheld anti-tank weapons like the famous Javelin, which the Ukrainians have used to great effect against Russian armor in the war. The T-14 also boasts a separate self-contained crew capsule that is isolated from its magazine and specifically designed to protect the three-man operating team from anti-tank fire, maximizing its defensiveness and aiding its ability to act as a command unit. Other shielding mechanisms include active defense systems at the front of the vehicle to shoot down common anti-tank weaponry, such as RPGs. The tank also reportedly has stealth features, with its armor having a lower radar cross-section than other tanks in use. But that's not all. The Armata is a quick and maneuverable tank, with a top speed of 75 to 80 km/h in both forward and reverse modes. In contrast, most of Russia's widely used tanks can only achieve a top speed of 4 km/h while in reverse, making them easy to target with anti-tank fire. The T-14 has a remote-controlled turret that loads automatically with a 45-round magazine. The standard gun is a 125mm 2A82-1M smoothbore, but it can be upgraded to a 2A83 152mm gun. Either type can also fire laser-guided missiles. The T-14's secondary weapons include the Cord 12.7mm machine gun or PKTM 7.62mm machine gun. The Armata's engagement range exceeds any Western tank, as it can hit targets up to 12 km away. Sounds incredible, right? Here's the thing though. All of these defensive and offensive features sound impressive, but Russia has proven that it isn't exactly a trustworthy source of information about its own capabilities. In reality, the T-14 has shown itself to be lacking so far, and not all is as it seems. The tank's problems stretch back to its debut, when one of them broke down and had to be towed away for repairs during a rehearsal for a military parade in Red Square in 2015, which would have been one of its first public showings. This proved only the first of many embarrassments. Often those shortcomings included not being able to pay for or manufacture the tank at scale. An impressive weapon means little if you cannot produce it in the numbers needed to shift the balance of power on the battlefield. That only one T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine after 9 months of war suggests a few problems for the Russians in actually using the tank. The T-14 has been plagued by numerous delays since its public debut in 2015. The Kremlin's initial plans to field 2,300 Armata tanks proved unaffordable, and Russia needed to settle for a much smaller total. The Russian armed forces expected the first batch of 9 in 2018, but the Kremlin moved the date back first to 2019 and then 2020. A 2020 report in The Diplomat stated that 132 Armatas would be delivered by 2022, but that has not happened either. It turns out that the company that manufactures the tank, Uralvagonzavod, also had its fair share of problems. The company is 87 billion rubles in debt and needed to cut the pay of its workforce by 21% between 2019 and 2020. These financial problems may be a reason why only 20 finished T-14s exist as of 2021. The Armata's frequent glitches and production delays came before the hefty sanctions the international community levied in retaliation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Such sanctions will make it even more difficult for Russia to obtain the materials it will need to manufacture the T-14's advanced electronics, among other systems. The T-14 may have all the high-tech features that Russia claims it has, but even if all of it was true and it all worked, it means little if the Russians cannot deploy them on the battlefield. The next-generation tank also means little if it's too expensive and becomes a white elephant, which may be the reason why Russia has been hesitant to use the T-14 in Ukraine until now. The Ukrainians have proven excellent tank killers and capturers in this war. The prospect of the T-14 falling into enemy hands must make the Kremlin take pause, and if you're too scared of losing a weapon system to deploy it, it's not exactly a useful tool. Indeed, because Russia has been unable or unwilling to produce the T-14 Armata at scale, it has instead used its resources to upgrade its older arsenal of tanks, such as the T-72, T-80, and T-90A. There are other problems for the T-14 tank as well, ones which go beyond cost, manufacturing, and delivery. One of the reasons for the delays includes continual glitches in the T-14's software. These glitches came partly because of sanctions that the West imposed on Russia following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. Particularly, a major weakness inherent in the Armata is that its much-vaunted protective crew capsule cannot revolve like the gun turret can. The engineering arrangement means that the tank relies on optical systems and electronics to deliver visual information to the crew. That is not exactly ideal when you can't get your software right, and even if it were to check out, how would the crew react to their electronics being taken out during a battle? Speaking of systems failure, some American Abrams crews who are familiar with the T-14 were not impressed with what they saw. They questioned the emphasis of its supposedly modern auto-loading cannon. When speaking in a 2018 report for Business Insider, they asked what would happen if something goes wrong in the middle of a battle and the automated loader stopped working. How much work would it take to get the breech open and get down in there? Since the self-isolated crew capsule is separate from the turret, the answer is it could take a lot of work. As the United States has seen with the F-35s and other expensive modern systems, sometimes having the most cutting-edge technology means you sign up for a lot more things potentially going wrong, and if anything is true on a battlefield, many things will go wrong. No plan survives the first contact with the enemy. Even if the T-14's auto-loading system works perfectly, it faces another disadvantage. It is slow. Auto-loading may sound modern, but an American Abrams crew with a human loader can actually get shots off faster. They can usually fire their weapons in 5-second intervals at the maximum, and more often than not under 4. According to Sergeant Emmett Fulgham, a tank gunner with 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, who talked about the subject to the military publication Coffee or Die. In contrast, the T-14's auto-loader takes 10 seconds or more to load and fire, meaning that its prospective Western opponents can get 2 or 3 shots off for every one that the Armata gets. The Armata may have a longer range, but with such limited numbers and large load times, it may simply not be able to put enough fire down range to tilt the scale of a battle, especially when there will not be many Armatas to begin with. The Armata has supposedly seen limited action in the field, and results have not been encouraging. According to the reports in Chinese media, the T-14 underperformed in its subdued use in Syria. Chinese media blasted the Russians for promoting false combat conditions under which the tank took part, claiming there was no evidence for anything that they were saying. With such praise from his friends, Vladimir Putin must be wondering what his enemies think. For their part, rebel factions in Syria commented that they had not encountered the Russians' newest tank. Other information out of Syria suggests that the Armata's vaunted system of protection didn't work so well. Reporting from 2020 indicated that soldiers wielding anti-tank weapons hit 3 T-14s, with one of them being completely destroyed. If such reports are true, it is feasible that the Armata's defenses do not live up to the Kremlin's hype, and that advanced anti-tank systems like the American Javelin, British NLAW, and Swedish AT-4 could destroy it, even if the crew in their isolated capsule compartment manages to survive the impact to the tank's turret and magazine. Perhaps this is the reason that only one Armata has been definitively spotted in Ukraine. Another problem that the T-14 faces is that foreign countries, even ones Russia has long had arms deals with like China, India, and Middle Eastern nations, don't seem eager to buy it. Russia has tried to sell the T-14 abroad, but it has found no buyers. The lack of foreign interest leaves Russia even more cash-strapped in developing it, since weapon R&D is expensive and foreign investments help to make the final product pay for itself. For example, robust foreign purchases of the F-35 Lightning II helped the United States share the burden in developing that infamously expensive platform. However, with the seeming lack of interest for Russia to buy one of its own assets and its design problems, other countries don't seem too keen on purchasing the Armata. China even claims that its next-generation VT-4 tank is superior to the Armata. The T-14 Armata's problems are large enough to make the Kremlin reconsider its investment in it. Another tank design, which reportedly lost out to the Armata in the 2000s, called the Burlak, is now the subject of discussion in the Russian military. This tank is less revolutionary. Instead, it evolves on Russia's older tank technology to produce a vehicle nearly as good as the Armata. Whether the Burlak reemerges and spells the doom of the T-14 project remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the T-14 shows us that appearances can be deceiving, and that most modern does not always mean most useful. But what do you think? Does the T-14 Armata have the potential to become the world's greatest tank? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Imagine that it's the year 2030. NATO forces operating somewhere near the Baltic coastline have come across a truly frightening sight. The Russian forces on the opposite end of no man's land are outfitted in body armor, which makes them look like a unit of Robocops. Their faces are covered with an intimidating helmet and visor that gives them an edge in the information domain. Their chests and all of their extremities are protected by overlapping bullet-resistant plates. To make matters worse, their armor also has an integrated exoskeleton that increases their strength, speed, and endurance. The protective power of their armor is also unparalleled. Even 50 caliber Browning machine gun rounds don't have enough stopping power to put these guys down. What's a NATO unit to do in the face of such fearsome enemies? Well, not much, because this scenario is likely to be as imaginary as anything that Hollywood can produce. Meet the Sotnik, Russia's next-generation body armor that worried defense officials and military experts when it was unveiled. If it works as advertised, there is reason indeed to be worried. but it probably won't. And there is a long history of Russian body armor failures to believe that it won't. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, defense and foreign policy analysts regarded its military as the second most capable fighting force in the world. It had demonstrated its post-Soviet prowess with experience in Chechnya in the 1990s and 2000s, Georgia in 2008, and Ukraine in 2014, when it rapidly secured control of Crimea. It was also a fearsome military. Experts remembered the devastation the Russian Air Force and artillery units had brought to the Chechen city of Grozny during multiple battles in the 1990s. Aside from the Kremlin building a formidable artillery-based land force that would be resilient against air attacks, experts also touted Russia's new, technologically advanced weapon systems. These platforms included the new 5th-generation Su-57 fighter jet and the T-14 Armata main battle tank, which was supposedly more advanced than any other tank in foreign arsenals. However, when Russia launched the invasion, these theories quickly got tossed to the winds. The supposedly fearsome Russian war machine proved hard-pressed to supply itself over even short distances. The T-14 and Su-57 were almost nowhere to be seen, and Russian soldiers found themselves bogged down in a costly war of attrition, suffering from poor command doctrine and Western weapons like the Javelin and HIMARS, which proved so devastating to their supposedly latest and greatest gear. Even the venerable Patriot air defense system, which first came online in the 1980s, was able to knock one of Russia's ultra-modern Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, which Vladimir Putin had once touted as invincible, out of the sky. Now the Russian military is boasting about its next-generation body armor, the Sotnik. If it delivers as promised, it will protect its wearer better than any other body armor system in the world, but like most Russian boasting, there's a lot of hype about the Sotnik and not a whole lot of facts. Since 2016, Russian troops have worn the Ratnik II body armor system, accompanied by the 6B45 helmet. The Ratnik's vest has an effective area protection that is larger than most other body-comparable armor systems. Based on a material similar to Kevlar, the Ratnik covers 90% of a soldier's body, and its granite ceramic plates can withstand 10 sniper rifle shots from a distance of only 10 meters. It is a good system to protect against shrapnel and explosive fragments too. The Ratnik's overalls protect the entire body from these flying pieces of metal and other debris. Ratnik 2 takes care to protect the groin and extremities like the hands. The 6B45 helmet, meanwhile, covers an area of 30 square decimeters with effective protection. Despite this, the helmet remains light at only 1 kilogram, which means that Russian military personnel can attach various instruments to it without adding undue strain on their necks. Such equipment includes thermal and night vision binoculars, flashlights, and a communication system with specialized headphones. Perhaps most impressively, the Ratnik II body armor has an electromagnetic camouflage system that shields its wearer from infrared sensors. The armor weighs between 40 and 50 pounds, but some of the weight is relieved by a passive carbon fiber exoskeleton. The exoskeleton also protects its wearer's spine and joints from the gradual wear and tear that lugging around such heavy weight will do to a person over time. This exoskeleton does not need an external power source to function. Ratnik is supposed to be getting an upgrade too. In 2020, Russia announced it would be developing its Ratnik III body armor system. This version would include an integrated exoskeleton, a helmet visor-mounted target designation system, stealth fabric, anti-mine boots, a vision system via electric goggles that would allow soldiers to link up with the camera views of small drones and see tactical orders or maps of the broader area, and an anti-thermal and anti-radar camouflage suit. The integrated exoskeleton for the Ratnik III was getting an upgrade as well. It was reportedly designed to comfortably haul weights of up to 132 pounds during combat operations. In 2021, American military planners were nervous about these developments. There was the feeling that the United States was lagging behind on body armor and exoskeleton systems for its soldiers and Marines. The revelation of Sotnik made American defense officials and think tanks even more nervous. Now they know better. Unfortunately for Russia, much of the hype about the Ratnik was a bunch of boasts, as we've come to expect by now. In 2017, the Russian army said it had received 200,000 sets of Ratnik II body armor. The following year, the Russian Ministry of Defense said it expected that all of its military personnel would be equipped with the Ratnik II by 2020. But 2020 came and went, and the Russian military failed in its goal. The invasion of Ukraine proved as such. Instead of getting standard-issue gear, Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, even those in the regular army at the start of the invasion, have had to make do with what body armor they could get. Most of the Ratnik's claims failed to materialize on the battlefield. Complaints about body armor and helmet malfunction have been frequent in the Russian ranks throughout the course of the war. Instead of the new Ratnik, some of the luckier Russian troops have been seen wearing older 6B23 body armor in Ukraine. This armor can be protective against indirect impacts like shrapnel or shell fragments, but lacks the ability to adequately defend its wearer from direct ballistic hits. Even if the enemy gunshots fail to penetrate the 6B23, the armor cannot easily disperse the energy the impacting bullets transfer to the human body. Broken bones and internal trauma were frequently reported among those who wore 6B23 body armor and suffered combat-related injuries. These shortcomings are what prompted the Kremlin to replace the 6B23 with the Ratnik family of armors in the first place. However, complete Ratnik armors were few and far between on the battlefields of Ukraine. What happened? Typical corruption within the Russian military's ranks has proven part of its body armor failures. In 2021, a Russian captain and ensign were convicted of stealing 56 sets of body armor and selling them online. The captain got a sentence of 6 years and the ensign got 7 years. Both of them are currently serving time in a penal colony. These two may have been made an example of, but they were hardly the only ones. It's common for officers in the Russian military to sell off top-of-the-line gear to line their own pockets, and then issue Cold War-era equipment to the soldiers under their command instead. The Russian military's body armor problems got much worse when Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization in the fall of 2022, as Ukraine was pushing his forces back in Kharkiv and Kherson, and he desperately needed additional manpower. According to defense intelligence officials in the UK, the conscripts Russia mobilized in late 2022 often had no choice but to buy their own body armor because Russian armories were short. Many of the armor kits that these people and their families wound up buying turned out to be fake too. Those lucky enough to get their hands on real Ratnik armor often wound up becoming victims of theft, as poorly equipped Russian regular troops at the front simply stole it from them. The demand led to a boom in the price of any kind of body armor that even looked real on Russian e-commerce sites. Body armor, and we use that term loosely in this context, can now fetch up to $650 a piece online in Russia. This is a price that most of the soldiers in Ukraine and their families cannot afford, especially because a disproportionate amount of the people conscripted to fight in the autumn of 2022 came from Russia's poorer ethnic minority communities. Ukrainian soldiers who have captured body armor worn by Russian soldiers on the battlefield have often found such gear fitted with cheap steel plates instead of the high-tech ceramics, which are now designed to slow the bullet down to reduce its impacting force. The ceramic plates in high-quality body armor like the American Interceptor also fracture and deform the bullet itself as it impacts the vest. This fracturing and deforming in turn distributes the bullet's energy over a wider area to protect the wearer against blunt force trauma. While some armies use steel instead of ceramics in their body armor, this steel is extremely tensile and specially manufactured to stand up to small arms ballistics. The captured steel plates in Ukraine, though, have proven little match for small arms fire. Standard 9mm parabellum rounds were shown to puncture the steel plates on videos posted to social media by Ukrainian soldiers. Rifle rounds easily did the job. They are little more than steel sheets stolen from somewhere else and fitted into what was supposed to be body armor. Captured Russian body armor also seemed to be little more than a cloth covering to hold the faulty steel plates in place. This is in contrast to Western body armor, which is made from Kevlar and other fabrics engineered to be resistant to small arms fire and shrapnel or explosive fragments. The Russian armor, meanwhile, seemed like it would only be good against fragments or shrapnel in the area that the plates directly covered. Indeed, Ukrainian troops have been seen on video bending the steel plates in captured Russian body armor with their hands, feet, and over their knees. They laugh contemptuously as they do so. This equipment is probably not official Ratnik armor, but rather knockoffs sold on Russian e-commerce sites. However, one Russian conscript even complained on video that he was given a vest that would only be effective against an airsoft gun. It turns out that the Russian logistics brass opted to buy the toy replicas of Ratnik armor for their mobilized soldiers and pocketed the rest of the money allocated to them. Even if Russian soldiers or conscripts are lucky enough to get their hands on legitimate Ratnik armor, it is often not a complete kit. Corruption is so widespread in the Russian military that the ceramic plates inside the Ratnik vests are often missing, either to cut costs or because they are valuable commodities to sell off in their own right. Corrupt Russian logistics officers instead sold off the ceramics and replaced them with the cheap, non-ballistic steel plates that Ukrainian soldiers made fun of in the videos. The lack of effective body armor in Ukraine has proven devastating for the Russian war effort. At the end of August 2023, the Pentagon released estimates which painted a grim picture for the Russians. According to the US military, total Russian casualties over the 18-month war were approaching the 300,000 mark. This total included about 120,000 dead and 170 to 180,000 combat-related injuries. Ukraine, meanwhile, was suffering too, with 70,000 KIA and between 100 and 120,000 wounded. However, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by nearly 3 to 1 on the battlefields of Ukraine. There are many reasons for this disparity in casualties despite Russia's manpower advantage, but the lack of proper body armor is a big one. The Russian body armor industry is in such a poor state that the military is now turning to Chinese equipment to make up for its shortcomings. China has been reluctant to provide military aid to Russia for fear of Western sanctions, but some Chinese firms have been supplying their beleaguered strategic partner with weapons and equipment through backdoor means. Such aid includes body armor. 12 tons worth of Chinese body armor were routed to Russia through Turkey in late 2022. The body armor came from companies such as Xinjiang Guangzhou Import and Export Company. Chinese companies have also sent component parts to Russian body armor manufacturers like Class, although it's not currently understood how widespread the Class vests have been used in Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers have captured Class vests on the battlefield too, although it's also unclear if these contain Chinese component parts. Ukrainian troops have been known to sell these captured materials online. Chinese body armor has been tested by American defense officials. This type of body armor uses aramid fibers, which are the same kind of fibers found in the familiar Kevlar vests used in the United States and other Western militaries. In the tests, the Chinese body armor's ceramic plates succeeded in stopping standard small arms fire, such as the 7.62mm round, from penetrating. However, the plates showed significant deformation. The deformation indicates that soldiers wearing this armor would suffer from blunt force trauma if struck by enemy fire, because the energy would not be dispersed over a wide enough area. If Russian troops are looking to this equipment to save them, they will probably wind up being disappointed. So as with many other aspects of its military, Russian body armor looks great on parade grounds and in the Kremlin's information networks. On the battlefield, not so much, and the results in Ukraine show it. For Russia, anything that can go wrong does seem to go wrong, thanks to institutional incompetence on every conceivable level. Now Russia has plans for its next-generation body armor, the Sotnik system, which the Kremlin says will come online in 2025, replacing the Ratnik family of armors. The armor was unveiled in early 2021, about a year before the invasion of Ukraine. The armor, developed by Russia's state Rostec Corporation, would be the most advanced and protective body armor in the world, if it works as advertised. But what have we come to learn about Russia's military's claims by now? According to Rostec, the Sotnik armor would be capable of protecting its wearer against small arms fire and even a direct hit from the 50 caliber Browning machine gun round, which can pierce lightly armored vehicles at a range of 2 kilometers. To protect against the shock of incoming rounds like the .50 BMG, which can transfer more than enough energy to kill, even if the bullet does not penetrate the body, the Sotnik armor will be made from ultra-high molecular weight polythene fibers. These fibers will be designed to not restrict a soldier's movement, even with the added protection. This principle works in theory because polythene is a plastic and plastic is light. But this raises a question: how can a plastic protect you against gunfire, let alone a 50 caliber round? As you would expect, plastics melt at high enough temperatures, including the heat a bullet makes as it transfers its energy to a target. The melting fibers adhere to the bullet and slow it down, allowing the other parts of the armor to stop it from penetrating and transfer its energy over a broader area. Because of its heavy use of plastics, the total weight of a set of Sotnik armor will supposedly be reduced by 20 pounds from the Ratnik family of armors. All in all, a set of Sotnik body armor will weigh around 44 pounds, according to Rostec. And as if all the cutting-edge technology wasn't enough, Rostec says it will develop an active titanium exoskeleton to integrate with the armor in the future. Rostec is researching power sources for how this feature would work. As early as 2021, however, there were some military and engineering experts who were skeptical about Russian claims. Since ancient times, armor has always been a compromise between protection and mobility. Too much protection leaves a wearer immobile. It's why some units from then to now chose not to wear any body armor at all. For them, mobility was their best protection. Other units preferred to fight with heavier armor because they did not expect to need a lot of mobility. The latest question in this age-old compromise is, can polythene armor capable of stopping a 50 caliber machine gun round be made lightweight enough for a soldier to actually be able to wear it and not be immobile? According to a 2021 analysis in Popular Mechanics, the answer was not promising. For comparison, a standard 7.62mm bullet transfers 1,878 pounds of force on its target. A 50 caliber Browning machine gun round is over 4 times that, at 11,070. To put that into perspective, this weight would be the same as if a 5-ton truck was sitting on your chest. American military gear can stop standard rifle rounds like 7.62mm, with a total weight on the soldier at 22.6 pounds. This is a good compromise between protection and mobility. Stopping a 50 caliber round is a whole different story, however. That would take 1.25 inches of AR-500 grade steel plate, but this type of steel is far too heavy to comfortably wear. It would make a modern soldier the equivalent of a caricatured version of a medieval knight wearing armor that was too heavy to move around in. The amount of polythene plastic that would be needed to stop a 50 caliber round, even accounting for greater efficiency, would almost certainly be impossible to wear on the battlefield and remain mobile. Popular Mechanics mentioned that Russia could try to compensate for this reality by adding titanium plating to the ensemble of a far more realistic amount of polythene. Since titanium is lighter and stronger than steel, the idea seems feasible. There is also precedent for it. Armorers in the Soviet Union made body armor with titanium components during the Cold War. However, even with this modification, stopping a 50 caliber round and leaving a soldier mobile enough to move around would be very difficult. The verdict about the idea of body armor reliably stopping 50 caliber rounds? Feasible, but don't put your money on it. It's also worth mentioning that 50 caliber machine gun rounds can easily punch holes in cinder block walls. Even if the body armor does stop penetration, dispersing over 11,000 pounds of force safely around the human body would be difficult. The blunt force trauma from the impact of a 50 caliber round would still likely be enough to kill. So even if the logistics to outfit all of Russia's soldiers with Sotnik body armor by 2025 work out, and there is every reason, as we've seen by now, to believe that they won't, the Sotnik still has a long way to go to prove the Kremlin's claims. If we have not learned to doubt those by now, we have not learned anything from the 18-month war in Ukraine. But what do you think about Russia's next-generation Sotnik body armor? Does it even have a chance of living up to the claims the Kremlin makes of it? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. First tanks and now submarines. Putin can't seem to keep hold of his weapons, with Russia's only aircraft carrier catching fire not once, not twice, but 3 times since 2018, and his guided missile cruiser, the Moskva, sinking in 2022. Russia's navy, widely considered one of the most powerful in the world, has seen better days. And now, Russia's submarine power is under serious threat. Here's why. It's no secret that things haven't been going well for Russia. From crushing sanctions to staggering military casualties, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has backfired in a host of unexpected ways. It has also highlighted profound weaknesses in Russia's military capabilities, exposing them as aging, corrupt, and poorly led. Nowhere is this more true than at sea. Despite statements by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev back in 2009 that, without a navy, Russia does not have a future as a state, the country's surface fleet remains embarrassingly inept. Former US Navy Admiral James G. Foggo recently noted that it has been allowed to atrophy due to factors like poor maintenance, low funding, and corruption. This trend has been on full display during recent years, with the Russian Navy suffering a number of embarrassing high-profile mishaps. Its only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, nicknamed the unluckiest ship in the world, has caught fire at least 3 times since 2018. Earlier this year, Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the ship is in critical condition and not capable of moving under its own power. That's not to mention the sinking of Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, in April 2022. But now there's an even bigger problem for Putin, one deep below the waves. For all the issues with its surface fleet, Russia's current fleet of 58 submarines have been long considered among the most powerful in the world. This includes 11 nuclear-powered ballistic missile subs, 17 nuclear-powered attack subs, and 9 nuclear-powered cruise missile subs, with several more on the way next year. While they haven't been a factor in Ukraine, they are still considered a critical threat by the US military. However, their power may not last forever. Recent reports suggest that Russia's submarine capabilities are being seriously harmed by the backlash to its invasion, especially through the crippling effect of Western sanctions. So what does that mean for the future of the Russian military? And just how serious of a blow could it be to Putin's war machine? To understand just how critical Putin's submarine problem could be, we first need to take a quick look at some Russian naval history, which, funnily enough, is permeated with continuing and humiliating losses of fleets. But wait, there's a plot twist, and it occurs just after World War II. Russia has had military power at sea in one form or another since 1696, when Peter the Great first established the Imperial Russian Navy. Impressed by his visits to Western Europe, Peter realized that Russia could never be a true great power while remaining landlocked. By 1710, he had over 58 ships in his fleet, and despite some defeats, by Peter's death in 1725, Russia was the dominant sea power in the Baltic. During the reign of Catherine the Great, the empire's ambitions at sea had grown, establishing a new Black Sea fleet and annexing Crimea for the first time in 1783. By the time of her death in 1796, Russia possessed the world's largest navy after Britain. This period was the height of Russia's imperial naval power. As naval historian Robert A. Theobald once put it, "To my mind, the death of Catherine marks the high watermark in Russian naval history. From this date to the end of the Imperial Navy, it was on a treadmill working hard but getting nowhere." This became obvious during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, where Russia suffered a stinging defeat to the combined forces of the Ottomans, France, and Britain. The shortcomings of the Imperial Navy were even more obvious by the time of the 1904–1905 Russo-Japanese War. But it gets worse. In response to Russian expansionism in the Far East, the newly industrialized Japanese military gave Russian Tsar Nicholas II a humiliating defeat at sea. The war marked Japan's emergence as a great power and contributed heavily to the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Following the Second Revolution in 1917, what remained of the old Imperial Navy came under control of the Soviet Union. And while Lenin and Stalin both aimed to rebuild a powerful Soviet Navy, it remained largely inept throughout both world wars and into the early 1950s. As Theobald described it in his well-known 1953 presentation at the US Naval War College, this is the history of a navy which has lost more complete fleets than any other navy in the world. It is the history of a navy which has never been more than second-rate, that has never been decisive in world history, and that has never developed a depth of tradition to compare with those of the Western navies. But this would change drastically only a few years after his assessment, mainly due to one factor: modern submarines. While Russia had some early submarines before World War II, the first modern Soviet ballistic missile submarines were completed in the late 1950s. These early Soviet models were diesel-electric and based on designs pioneered by the Germans, similar to the United States. However, by 1960, the Soviet Navy had launched its first nuclear-powered attack submarines, giving the USSR below-surface capabilities greater than perhaps any country except the US. Soon after, the Soviets also developed nuclear SSGN-class subs, running on nuclear power, but designed to launch limited ballistic missile strikes against American aircraft carriers and other naval deployments. Over the next 3 decades, the Soviet Navy continued to build and maintain a large fleet of submarines, relying on them heavily to challenge America's greater military strength during the Cold War. Because the true names of Soviet subs were rarely known abroad, most are still referred to by NATO codenames, such as the Alpha-class nuclear subs. These use liquid metal-cooled reactor propulsion systems and titanium hulls, enabling them to move extremely fast, over 43 knots or 80 kilometers an hour. at an operational depth of 2,000 feet or 600 meters. Also important to Soviet deterrence and power projection were the Typhoon-class subs. The largest submarines ever built, Typhoons are over 563 feet or 172 meters long, have a beam of 81 feet or 25 meters, and can carry up to 20 Sturgeon nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. These were just a few of the many varieties of subs developed by the Soviet Navy, and the Soviets also continued heavily building diesel-electric models as well, such as the Kilo-class attack subs and others. The fleet was never able to make the switch to fully nuclear-powered, largely due to budgetary and technological constraints. However, by its peak in 1980, the USSR's submarine force had 480 boats, including 71 fast attack and 94 cruise and ballistic missile submarines. Even following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, this submarine fleet remained a major part of Russia's naval power. Dmitry Gorenberg of the Center for Naval Analyses has noted that during the post-Cold War period, Putin has focused on developing new submarine capabilities, while Russia has essentially lost the ability to construct new, advanced surface vessels. The most advanced of these submarine developments are the Yasen and updated Yasen M-class SSGNs. Developed in the 1990s and early 2000s, Rand Corporation researcher Edward Geist has described these as the crown jewel of the contemporary Russian Navy, and perhaps the pinnacle of present-day Russian military technology. And according to Admiral Foggo, one major advantage of the Yasen-class vessels is that they are very quiet, which is the most important thing in submarine warfare. They can also carry both Zircon hypersonic and long-range Caliber cruise missiles. Yet these deadly subs also come with a hefty price tag. The Severodvinsk, the first Yasen-class model, reportedly cost over $1.6 billion. While this is still much cheaper than the US's most advanced subs, it is a very high price tag considering Russia's far smaller economy. In the past few years, Putin's government has also claimed that even more nuclear subs are in the works, including what Russian state media claim to be a new division of submarines carrying nuclear-capable super torpedoes in the coming years. Nick Childs, Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has argued that investments in submarines up to this point are one of the only things which has allowed Russia to maintain its status among the leading powers. While its fleet is still far smaller than during the Soviet era, Childs points out that it remains very capable, and along with some of the older submarines, would still pose a threat to NATO, both at sea and against land-based targets. But even before the war in Ukraine, there were some doubts about the true effectiveness of Russia's impressive-seeming subs. While they are doubtless in better shape than its surface fleet, they have never been truly tested in combat. So how are Putin's submarine fleets faring in the Russo-Ukraine conflict? On land, the reckless nature of Russian military doctrine has been on full display in the invasion of Ukraine. But despite the enormous losses by Russia's ground forces, its navy has so far played a very limited role in the conflict. This includes its submarines, which have remained mostly as a nuclear deterrent and threat. The exception to this is Russia's Black Sea Fleet, where submarines off the coast of Sevastopol and Novorossiysk have been used to fire Caliber missiles into Ukraine. None of these subs have so far been damaged or destroyed, and there are still concerns that they could be used to counter NATO activity and control trade routes in the Black Sea. But the consequences of Putin's invasion have created a different kind of problem for the Russian Navy and its submarines. The crushing regime of Western sanctions imposed on Russia has begun to erode the country's ability to resupply and maintain its military industry. And in December of 2022, the US State Department added even more sanctions directly targeting Russia's naval power. These have already begun to work, cutting Russia off from the technology required in modern subs. As Admiral Foggo told Newsweek in an interview, "I think they have been severely crippled by these economic sanctions and by their own foolishness in the war in Ukraine. In particular, the maintenance of existing subs and development of new ones will become increasingly difficult since, when they don't have the raw materials, they can't sustain the industrial base. They don't have the manpower, because that manpower is going into fighting the war in Ukraine." Military losses and brain drain make it likely that Russia will lose its ability to compete with Western countries in submarine development, especially when it comes to their ability to project power. Graham P. Hurd of the George C. Marshall European Centre for Security Studies argues that the protracted nature of the conflict and the coming Ukrainian counter-offensive undercuts Russian military credibility. The repeated military failures in Ukraine have created growing pressure in Russia to project an image of strength through its submarines. In turn, this has incentivized the Russian Navy to take greater risks by using submarines which are not seaworthy and fast-tracking new weapon systems without proper testing. Hurd added that submarines are the most expensive ticket item in Russia's military budget and have no obvious utility in this war, so Russia compensates and projects power through acceptance of greater risk. As a consequence, Russia's submarines will suffer indirect and long-term damage the longer the war lasts. Similarly, Hurd and other experts have pointed out that the sanctions illustrate just how much of Russia's military-industrial complex was, and remains, reliant on critical Western technology. Without the advanced components for submarines manufactured in the US, UK, France, Germany, and elsewhere, Russian development will be seriously stunted in the years to come. And there are almost no alternatives to the technology which sanctions have cut Russia off from. Parts from China and Iran, for example, are not advanced enough to meet Moscow's requirements. While experts remain divided on just how dependent Russia's nuclear submarines are on Western tech, it's pretty clear that at least some of the imported components are necessary to build new vessels. These are mostly thought to be technologically advanced electronic components for guidance, communication, and missile deployment. Russian defense journalist Alexander Timokhin wrote in January that the sanctions imposed on Russia after the special military operation left a sharp imprint on the country's technological capabilities. The production of radar complexes, communication systems, guided missiles, sonar equipment, and other similar systems has proved to be difficult. As a consequence, these restrictions could make it nearly impossible to build Yasen and Yasen M-class subs and other highly capable boats. Childs from the International Institute for Strategic Studies points out that this trajectory is already visible, as while the newest Russian submarines are very capable, Russia's inefficient shipbuilding industry has struggled to deliver them on time and in significant numbers. Like other experts, he agrees that Russia's construction shortfalls will accelerate in the coming months and years, since this could well be exacerbated by the increased demands on other sectors of the defense industry as a result of the war, as well as from the impact of sanctions on certain key components. So what do these deficiencies mean for Putin's ambitions and the future of the Russian military? Well, experts have outlined two main possible scenarios for the future of Russia's submarine fleet. One possibility is that as military resource constraints continue to grow, it will lead to prioritization of the elements which have been most impacted, especially ground forces. As of May 2023, Russia has lost nearly 200,000 soldiers, a truly staggering figure for a modern military. In turn, as one analyst put it, that will inevitably lead to cuts, or limits at least, in shipbuilding in the future. The other possibility is that Russia will be forced to funnel more investment into submarines due to their relative importance and strategic value. This will mean less and less resources for replenishing ground troops and equipment, which are both cheaper and more expendable. But even if Putin opts for the second scenario, any money spent now is likely to have a delayed impact. Past investments in submarine development and maintenance will carry the Russian fleet for at least a few more years to come, but within 5 to 10 years, it could be a very different picture. Just based on the size and current capabilities of Russian submarines, it will likely remain one of the world's most powerful fleets for the next decade. But after that, things are far more uncertain. Any modern submarine which breaks down in the years could become essentially useless, reduced to just so much expensive scrap metal. However Putin attempts to manage his growing economic constraints, the main role of Russian submarines will probably remain as a nuclear deterrent. And there are also some indications that Putin has already realized just how spread thin his resources really are. In March, Russia's Pacific Fleet underwent a series of military drills which were described as a surprise inspection of more than a dozen submarines, potentially signaling a lack of faith by the Kremlin in the readiness or maintenance of the fleet. Readouts from the Kremlin show that Putin recently told Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu that while Russia's priorities remain the war in Ukraine, still, the objective to develop the Navy, including in the Pacific Theater of Operations, remains relevant. Adding that, it is clear that some of the fleet's assets can be used in conflicts elsewhere. This indicates both that Putin does not believe submarines can make much of a difference in Ukraine, and that they remain most useful as a nuclear deterrent. As Russia's submarines begin to break down in the coming years, with no easy way to maintain them or build new state-of-the-art models, the country will also become less able to project power in this way. This will almost certainly happen, regardless of where the Kremlin prioritizes resources, especially since casualties in Ukraine show no sign of slowing down. As losses climb higher and higher, and as sanctions continue their squeeze, it may also provoke Putin into even more aggressive and reckless strategies. In fact, there is evidence that this is already taking place. In the past few months, Russia has deployed submarines in increasingly threatening positions. As Michael Peterson, the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute, told Newsweek, "We have indications that nuclear-powered submarines have been deploying off the coast of the United States and into the Mediterranean and elsewhere along Europe periphery, in ways that mirror Soviet-style submarine deployments in the Cold War." Such aggressive posturing is likely tied to Putin's growing issues in an attempt to project a facade of Russia as a true global power, despite an economy less than half the size of California. This weakness is also reflected in overly optimistic predictions for its military-industrial complex. A recent analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, concluded, similarly to other experts, that Russian officials continue to claim that Russian defense manufacturers are increasing production amidst ongoing indications that the Russian Defense Industrial Base (DIB) is unable to meet Russia's long-term economic and military goals. There have been rosy claims by officials like Alexei Rachmanov, head of the Russian United Shipbuilding Company, that submarine production time will soon be cut by 8 to 13 months. But there is little evidence to support this, and in another sign of growing weakness, Putin signed a decree on February the 27th, reducing previous plans to construct at least 3 nuclear reactor-equipped Leida-class icebreakers by 2035 down to just a single vessel. Again, this likely reflects the fact that the need to replenish the stocks of conventional ground weaponry lost in Ukraine will likely consume the majority of Russia's DIB and limit Russia's ability to produce systems aimed at longer-term strategic goals. This includes both nuclear icebreakers and submarines, indicating that Russia's resources are spread much thinner than Putin would like the world to believe. So, to sum up, despite the claims by the Kremlin, there are strong signs that Russia's disastrous strategy in Ukraine has backfired even more than we know. The squeeze of Western sanctions now threatens to render even the deadly Russian submarine fleet obsolete. The longer the war goes on and the more isolated Russia becomes, the harder it will be to obtain the advanced components needed for these vessels. This will continue to erode the country's industrial base, possibly crippling all long-term defense production. And because Russian losses in Ukraine are so heavy, Putin also faces a crisis of credibility and growing pressure to project a facade of power. This has already led to reckless, aggressive posturing by Russian subs and a willingness to use vessels which are not even seaworthy, a problem which seems likely to increase. Because the Russian Navy has historically been so reliant on them to project power, there is little question that the stagnation of its submarine fleet will be a serious blow in the coming years. But what do you think? Will sanctions and battlefield losses eventually doom Russia's submarine fleet? Or can Putin find a way around these issues and keep Russia as a great power? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.